Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Chris Sands, and I'm director of our Canada Institute here, and I couldn't be more proud of our team for this terrific event today, our Canada-U.S. Legal Symposium focused on artificial intelligence and the law. We are very lucky at the Wilson Center to not only have a Canada Institute, which is pretty rare, but also to have a Science, Technology, and Innovation program. Kelly Wicker, our director, is here. You'll see her later today. She's been a great partner, and she actually understands AI, at least better than I do. So that's been, I do the Canadians, so that's something. But it's been great partnering with her, and it's been also great to partner with the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, one of the unique organizations in the Canada-U.S. relationship, a partnership between Case Western Reserve University School of Law and Western University Faculty of Law in the university, what we used to call the University of Western Ontario. Now we call it the Western University, and I just add Ontario so that Americans aren't confused which one I'm talking about. Both of those schools have maintained an ongoing dialogue since 1971 on issues in the law between our two countries. And today, this meeting will focus on one of the cutting-edge issues in our relationship. To start us off, I am always honored to be able to introduce the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, former member of Congress for 6 terms from the great state of Wisconsin, which even though I'm from Michigan, I still have a lot of respect for. And also former U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania, former USAID administrator, but most importantly, President and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green.
Thank you, Chris. Governor, good to see you again as always. I want to also thank the Canada Institute and the Science, Technology, and Innovation program for putting together today's symposium. And I also want to recognize our organizing partners at the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. So let me add my welcome to all of you from the Wilson Center. You know, we're a unique institution in foreign policy. We're congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, and we're fiercely nonpartisan and independent. And I always say that special status brings with it certain obligations to not duplicate what others are doing, but to try to prioritize the most important and look for ways to add value and to make a difference, which makes this a perfect place for today's discussions. In the North American technology space in recent years, there's been no more attention-getting, headline-grabbing issue than the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence. AI tools are unlocking exciting new opportunities across every industry and sector, from agriculture to the media. Canada and the U.S. are not the only participants in the AI revolution, to be sure, but we're active leaders. Thanks to our vast research networks, forward-thinking policies, and well-established technology ecosystems. AI has brought tremendous opportunities for our two countries. It has also spawned challenges that are forcing us to rethink how our legal and regulatory systems intersect with the large-scale change instigated by emerging technologies. We must consider how copyright and IP law is applied to massive sets of training data for generative AI models. We must think through how to treat computer-generated deepfakes and disinformation shared to millions of users across the internet. We must evaluate frameworks that can be applied at the subnational, national, and multinational levels. As the only think tank in Washington with programs dedicated to both Canada and also science and technology, STIP as we call it, the Wilson Center is uniquely positioned to bring together some of the leading thinkers on AI from Canadian and U.S. academia, industry, and government. I hope that we can work towards collaborative solutions to these issues and more. I encourage everybody here today, speakers and audience members alike, to approach each session with an open mind, to engage and discuss the topics with other experts in the room, and to use this symposium as a launching pad for novel legal ideas for handling the issue of AI. It is now my pleasure to turn the podium over to an expert, Mr. Stephen Petrus, U.S. Director of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute and Director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Stephen, it's great to have you, and we look forward to getting things underway.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Green, and thank you, Chris, and to the Wilson Center. It's an honor and a privilege for the Canada-United States Law Institute to have this program here at the Wilson Center in conjunction and partnership with the Wilson Center. Chris Sands is a very valued member of our executive committee, and I also want to make sure that I introduce we have two chairs. We have a U.S. chair and a Canadian chair. Our U.S. chair is here, which is Jim Blanchard, former governor of Michigan, former representative of Michigan, former U.S. ambassador to Canada. So it's great to have you here, Jim. Our Canadian co-chair is Peter MacKay, former Attorney General of Canada, former Minister of Defense of Canada, and he actually is going to be here. He's on a train, I think, getting into Washington. And it's very timely. Our executive committee thought long and hard about, what are the important topics facing Canada and the United States? There are a lot of big topics going on today, right? We could talk about elections, we could talk about world events, we could talk about China, all those things we talked about. And Chris Sands gave a very compelling case that AI is really important. It's important now, and it's going to be important for generations to come. And what is the position of the United States and Canada, and how are we going to go forward, and what are the challenges that we're going to face, both just on a technology basis, but how is this going to change our two societies and this close relationship between Canada and the United States? And I thought it was very interesting because how timely is this that the November issue of National Geographic, which, shouldn't even be out until Friday, right? But it's already out. Has a whole article, a very large article, on artificial intelligence and where it's going. And unlike a lot of scary articles, this isn't about Skynet all of a sudden getting self-awareness and taking over the world like in Terminator, but it's what are the great uses that we can use. But one thing really caught the challenge of artificial intelligence, and it's a quote from Riyad Ghani, who's at Carnegie Mellon University, a professor of artificial intelligence. And here's what he said. The process of artificial intelligence puts greater emphasis on probability than on truth. Now that's a big challenge, a greater emphasis on probability than truth. And that's going to be a big challenge for us. And that's what our panels are going to help us discuss and work our way through. We have a great outstanding panel, a set of panels, and the first moderator, who I'm going to introduce again in a second, but before I do, I want to remind everyone that we do have an annual conference. This will be our 48th year in existence since 1976. It'll be April 10 and 11 in Cleveland, and that's going to look at the USMCA, or what the Canadians call CUSMA, the Canadian-US-Mexico Agreement. So I hope you can all join us. But to kick off this program and to start our first panel, it's back to Chris Sands. Thank you, Chris.
Well, good morning again, everyone. If you've looked at the program, this is billed as a fireside chat. I know the format, but we're not really in club chairs, and they're a long way away from me, and we don't have a fire, so I think I'm going to dub this a flag side chat, because it's definitely flag side. Maybe that'll give us something to start with. We have two outstanding opening chatters with me, and I'm going to introduce them following the great American rule of baseball, starting with the visiting team up to bat first, and then we'll go to the American team. Mark Shan is the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet for Artificial Intelligence, and came to that from his previous post as Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategy and Innovation Policy at the Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, ISED, for those who follow. Mark earned his doctorate in philosophy in social policy from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He's been awarded the Nathalie de Rosier Audacity of Imagination Award, which is a great award to have because it just sounds good. The Barnett Prize in Social Policy, and has been actively involved in his community in Ottawa, chairing the board of the Ottawa Art Gallery, founding a new initiative at the National Gallery of Canada, active involvement in something called the 10 Oaks Project, which I Googled because I thought it was really interesting. It is a project for the future of the National Gallery that includes Project Acorn, a community building space for youth of LGBTQ plus identities, families, and their communities in Ottawa. So very good work that you do. Also should mention, Mark, and you can explain it, but you have a little patch of orange on, and I'll let you explain that when you get going, because I think that's important to acknowledge as well. Along with Mark, we have Ella Tabasi, who is the Chief AI Advisor at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and is the Associate Director for Emerging Technologies in the Information Technology Laboratory, ITL, at NIST. She also leads NIST's Trustworthy and Responsible AI program that aims to cultivate trust in the design, development, and use of AI technologies. Ellen's been working on various machine learning and computer vision research projects with applications in biometrics evaluation and standards since she joined NIST in 1999. She is a member of the National AI Resource Research Task Force, vice chair of the OECD Working Party on AI Governance, associate editor of the IEEE, Transaction on Information Forensics and Security, and a fellow of the Washington Academy of Sciences. So welcome to you both. First question, maybe to get us started, and also sort of a level set. Mark, to start the conversation, would you give us a sense of AI policy development in Canada, what the process has been thus far, and the part that you now play in this development? And we'll come to you next for this.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks to both the Canada United States Law Institute and the Wilson Center for the kind invitation. Really quickly, my little patch is a moose hide, and it's from a campaign from a woman in Northern Ontario who was skinning a moose with her father and was having a conversation about gender-based violence against Indigenous women, and had a conversation about what would be a meaningful way to be able to engage in that conversation and get a broader movement. And the result was that men in their community, and then now men and people everywhere potentially, would wear this moose hide as a commitment to both ending gender-based violence against Indigenous women and also furthering the conversation. And so thanks for the chance to
Great to start a conversation on AI by talking about people.
Indeed.
I think we should.
I agree. Canadian AI policy development, people who've heard me speak before will have heard me say this before, but I think Canada needs to think about AI and has thought about AI as a long game. And I think to look at AI policy development in Canada, you really should actually kind of take a step back and actually go back. So it's now 41 years, if I'm correct, since the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, or CFAR, which is one of our kind of umbrella granting agencies, at the incidence of the push of Geoffrey Hinton, created an artificial intelligence research program under CFAR. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that for two reasons. One is when they did it 41 years ago, it was not cool. They were not the issue du jour. And in fact, there was decent chunks of the scientific community who thought that this was a bit of a lark. And 41 years later, Jeff is now a Nobel Prize winner. Always interesting when a computer scientist wins a physics award. And we obviously have the foundations of both neural networks and of machine learning as a product of some of that continued commitment to foundational and fundamental science. And so part of our policy development from the Canadian perspective, I think, needs to start with the notion that you need to start with inquiry, and you actually need to have a strong commitment to the foundations that are going to build new technologies. And in the case of AI, I think that means ensuring that we actually do have a strong commitment to foundational research and to scientific kind of discovery that allows for that to happen. So Canada's played an outsized role in the development of the technology itself, largely on the science and research side. but wasn't a stranger to some of the kind of ethical and legal questions from a policy perspective. And so when Canada last hosted the G7 presidency, our kind of commitments coming out of Charlevoix helped pave the way for the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which is now the Integrated Partnership on AI at the OECD, which was picked up by the French and was a first kind of commitment to the notion that multilateral cooperation on applied projects in this space were going to be critical to actually making sure that we could advance an understanding of what appropriate guardrails would be and what responsible and ethical actually looks like. I think at the time of GPA's forming, which is a little bit bananas that it's only 7 years ago, the notion was we are far, far away from advanced development of this technology, and what we really need now is kind of norm setting and really broad kind of consideration around, the broad brush of the technology. And fast forward nearly 7 years, because Canada will have the G7 presidency next year, and we are now in full go mode. Some of you probably got an update to your phone yesterday that has AI capabilities. Many of you probably got here as a function of AI capabilities, and we are now seeing use cases in real time. So Canada needed to very much quickly advance its prospects in that space. And so we went from kind of let's play nice and kind of do norm setting to very quickly thinking about where does rubber hit road. And so we've done that both internal to our government. So we have long had a set of rules around automated decision making by government itself. We have a new set of guidance on generative AI use by public servants. And we've had an algorithmic impact assessment requirement for government programs now for a couple of years. On the private sector side, we've been engaged in a process by which we've been setting out what we think are appropriate regulatory early structures, and that is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. It's a third leg of a stool of a much broader digital modernization that we've been at, which ties itself to privacy modernization. But we also have an industry voluntary code on generative AI. And we've been super active in the international multilateral settings around standards, norm setting, and some of this kind of ongoing effort. We're also signatories and co-badging on the principles for artificial intelligence in national defense and national security communities, which I think is another piece that we'll probably come to. My role is the recent kind of piece to that, which is 3 months ago, the Prime Minister and the Clerk of the Privy Council decided that the government really needed a focal point and what I like to call a disruptive interventionary force into the federal family around artificial intelligence. And so created a secretariat dedicated towards the coordination function within our government. And our mandate is extraordinarily large. So when I got the call, I asked, is this just about the public service, or is this just about international, or is this just about the economy, or is this just about security or defense? And the answer was no. It's all of those things. So we are very much hard at work trying to kind of identify the major areas where we see a role to be able to increase Canada's impact and really continue to seize our leadership, knowing the outsized role that we played in the development of the technology at outset.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Ellen, can you talk about the American process and where you fit in that picture as well?
Yeah, happy to. First, I want to extend my thanks and gratitude to Wilson Center, the Canada Institute, for including me in these important conversations among the esteemed panels. Let me first start with who we are, National Institute of Standards and Technology, because you may or may not know about what NIST is. NIST is a non-regulatory agency under Department of Commerce. It was established in 1902 to fix the weights and measure for mass, electricity, length, everything that was important for the foundations of the technology at the turn of the century, and we have been continuing that tradition, working on measurement science and standards that are needed for the technology of our time, AI. NIST has a very broad portfolio of research, from building the most accurate atomic clock to modeling the behavior of the wildfires But most importantly, we have a long-standing tradition on cultivating trust in technology. We have been doing it for many areas, from cybersecurity to quantum, and we do it by advancing measurement science and standards that make technology more reliable, more accurate, more secure, more private, in other words, more trustworthy. And that is the focus of our work in the AI space. Broadly, taking myself out of the small space of NIST and answering your questions about the policy landscape in U.S. First disclaimer is that I'm an engineer, computer scientist, not lawyer, but I think every conversation in AI is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, so talking about all of that. So I'll try to just like Canada, I think U.S. and definitely NIST has a long lineage of working on AI as a foundational space, as a foundational discipline. And then also the applied, you mentioned the Nobel Prize. AlphaFold also got the Nobel Prize for the chemistry, which again warms our heart when we see computer scientists are getting into the hard sciences. But going to the policy landscape, I'll try to just go kind of chronologically from now to back. Last year, White House released the National Security Memorandum that talks about use of AI for national security, a lot of really important topics there. This week also, we're going to celebrate the 1 year after the launch of the Executive Order 14110 for safe, secure, trustworthy AI that came out October 30th last year. It focuses on ensuring that AI is reliable, secure, safe, and trustworthy, mostly through ensuring that we have a robust, reliable, repeatable, scientific, interoperable standards and evaluations methods. And I want to come back to the measurement science and standards. That's our sort of bread and butter at NIST. And we are all a big fan of this quote from Lord Kelvin that you cannot improve something that you cannot measure. So if you really want to improve the trustworthiness of the AI systems, first we ought to understand what it means and then be able to measure them. So the last year, Executive Order gave many different tasks to many different agencies, including us, and so far, Executive Order had a 100% deliverable rate, which is great. Happy to talk about some of the work we did on the EO, but going back on the policy, the same week last year that EO was delivered, OMB also put out a draft OMB guidance, which was finalized in December. That gives requires agencies to have some sort of a risk management and basically come up with the minimum risk management practices. So kind of understand the risks that they have. In AI/RMF, we call them MAP, have methods, identify methods to measure them, and have a process for managing this. That includes both the technical and socio-technical for understanding risk, but also the policy and institutional measures. Then going back in time, White House also had secured voluntary commitment, I think way back in May, and then updated in September, where major companies that are developing foundational AI algorithm sort of provide voluntary commitment to make sure that the models that they develop are developed in a safe, secure, trustworthy manner. In terms of then I just go back about 2, maybe 3 years ago, AI Act of 2020, as part of the NDAA FY21, National Defense Authorization Act of 2021, also puts a lot of actions in motions, including asking NIST us to develop the AI risk management framework. Gives us 2 years to do that, which we released on January 2023. That we have been very pleased and humbled with the receptions of the AI/RMF nationally and internationally. Happy to talk a little bit more about that, but also established a task force to look at sort of the feasibility and implementation plan for establishing a national AI research resource, and that is trying to sort of provide access to data and compute. As we know, data and compute are the oxygen and blood for AI development, and provide those resources to universities, to small and medium-sized businesses that do not have the fortune of having access to a large amount of the GPUs. So that is, I think, the best way of talking about the intent of the NER is to sort of reboot the research ecosystem in US by providing access, that therefore increasing the diversity of the researchers and participants in the research ecosystem. And then sort of, it's not policy, but I think it's also important to say that, by the way, NER also did the pilot. The pilot of NER is already going on, and I think a lot of really good things can happen through that. I also want to mention that NSF started this initiative of establishing national AI research institutes. These are co-funded between NSF and other agencies. NIST has teamed up with NSF to establish one of them, and these are sort of focused, larger scale investments of 4 years, for 5 years, so that some good progress can be made. Mm-hmm. So this seems quite several activities happening, and of course at the at the federal level and state level, there are several legislations under discussions. I think the past Congress had something about 100 or so, or the current Congress had something about 100 or so AI bills under consideration.
Mm-hmm. To sort of abstract from that, where do you see Canada and the U.S. in terms of their policy priorities and what they're trying to get done first? Where do you see them aligned, and are there some areas where we diverge? And if I can do a follow-up before I let you answer the question, in the alignment, how conscious is it? Are both sides looking at each other to try to make sure we align, since we share so much of our economy? Mark?
So I think we share a lot of alignment, and I think there's been a ton of kind of conscious effort to work together in a number of these spaces. I think the kind of principal ones that I would point to from an alignment perspective, it was heartening to see in the follow-up to the executive order on the National Security Memorandum that came out last week, was a number of components, one of which was a fundamental commitment from the United States to continue to build out an AI ecosystem, recognizing that AI expertise and capacity is fundamental to ensuring our national security, that we essentially can stay at least at the forefront, if not ahead of hostile state actors that we know potentially might be looking to harness the power of artificial intelligence. Canada has had a similarly long-standing commitment to building out that ecosystem over the course of a number of decades. I spoke about our work on the research side, but similarly, we were the first country in the world to have an AI strategy. We have a pan-Canadian artificial intelligence strategy, and that has given birth to 3 extraordinary institutes, the Vector Institute in Toronto, Mila in Montreal, and Amy in Edmonton. And so I think on kind of continued commitment to research, we are fundamentally aligned. I think the memorandum then also talked about experimentation and the need to continue to engage with frontier models. I think that was specific to the national security community, but I actually think it is broader. And I think therein we share a desire and an interest in making sure that we are actually seeing the opportunity side of artificial intelligence. I think there is a shared consideration around the dual-use nature and the need for understanding of the most fundamental risks related to artificial intelligence, and that's buoyed and really kind of best exemplified by our shared commitment to AI safety. So Canada has an AI Safety Institute, as does the United States, and at the AI Safety Summit in Korea, we continued our commitment to establishing a network of AI Safety Institutes, and we look forward to the first gathering of the technology and technologist side of that equation in San Francisco in November. I think we share a really strong desire on compute, recognizing we are starting from a slightly different space, which is to say that you have lots of it and we have very little of it. But our last budget did commit $2 billion to the build out of sovereign compute capacity in Canada, and there's active engagement between our countries about the role that we can play as part of a broader supply chain and ecosystem, which often then comes into some questions about access to power, which is a provincial jurisdiction in Canada. Where I think we might have a certain amount of divergence, and I don't think it's divergence per se. I think it is an evolving context that I think will continue to play out. Is the United States has placed a really strong emphasis on kind of getting AI to its right space in two fundamental manners. One is through kind of safety and standardization, as Ellen has very much kind of eloquently outlined. And then the other is that there are parts of this administration that have also focused its efforts on getting the marketplace right. And so the folks on your competition authorities have had a few things to say about the degree to which they want to make sure that marketplace is sort of working. Canada has been equally engaged on the safety side, but I think has been far more preoccupied on having mandatory obligations as it relates to a broader set of standards and regulations for the responsible use of AI that go beyond just bioterrorism, cyber, and mis and disinformation risk or synthetic content risk. And so in that vein, we do have the proposal for a mandatory obligation for regulations related to high-impact AI systems around things like transparency, bias, and discrimination. And the U.S. to date has chosen a voluntary approach for the most part, and has not sought kind of hard law as it relates to that space. And I think that is likely to remain the case for at least the short term, although as noted, there are more than 100 legislative proposals currently making their way through. But I think our commitment is that we do see a need to have some sort of hard backstop, notwithstanding the evolving nature of the technology. And I think therein, notwithstanding our slight differences about approach, I think the commitment to interoperability and the commitment to having a functional and meaningful marketplace that actually allows for AI technology companies on both sides of the border to both have predictability and capacity to be able to engage is fundamentally at the heart of our effort. And so I think we will continue to be conscious of that, notwithstanding the fact that in one spot, we've placed a slightly different emphasis in terms of the tool.
Excellent. Ellen?
Thank you. That plus one to almost everything that Mark, you mentioned. I just want to quickly go over areas that we are aligned. I think both sides, and we see it also globally, a commitment to make sure that we advance innovations in AI. We make sure that AI is, as it's transforming our society and making our lives better, also uplift everybody in a best way. So the attentions to understanding risk, mitigating risk, and I just have to say that I mentioned AI risk management framework, and the way in that document risk is defined, which is borrowed from definitions in some of the ISO standards and some of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB in the US. It's about a composite measure of the probability of an event happening and the consequence of that event. It doesn't say anything about the consequences, positive or negative or neutral, so all of them are included. What it means is that risk management becomes about maximizing the positive or beneficial consequence and impact of AI while minimizing its negative impact. And that, I think that's a very important point to have in mind as we're talking about the risk of AI. Going back and talking about the alignment and cooperations, Mark mentioned several Canadian institutes, ICET, CFAR, MILA. We have been working with all of them, particularly ICET around this and Standard Council of Canada. They were at NIST earlier this summer. Time is blurred in my mind. And a lot of really strong commitment, collaborations, and alignment. to develop interoperable methods and measures for assuring AI trustworthiness and standards around those. And of course, Mila and the work that Joshua is doing on the drafting the state of AI safety and the work that's happening there. So these are all great and good. So at the all level of foundational science to applications to standard, a lot of really good conversations going on. I just want to make a comment, observations on the voluntary approach. Of course, I just talked about our work at NIST, and I mentioned at the beginning that we are a non-regulatory agency. That doesn't mean that we are pro or against regulations. We're just regulation agnostic. But I just want to emphasize again from the lens of the NIST mission measurement. We already have seen some of the legislations in U.S. and abroad that, for example, ask for AI to be safe, as it has happened in the EU AI Act, or AI to be non-discriminatory, as we saw in legislations in New York. And laws and legislations, for good reasons, stay at that abstract level and leave the unpacking of what it means to be safe and how to test and assure for safety, how it means, what in non-discriminatory means, and how to test and assure for that to technical community. In case of the EU, they explicitly handed it to their standard body and said, basically, go figure it out, right? So that's where institutes like NIST come in. And I think, Mark, you also alluded to this, that as these important conversations around policy and regulations are happening, regardless of the policy and regulation landscape, we need to build and strengthen the scientific underpinning for particularly measurement. So this unpacking the concept of whatever law says, is it safety, trustworthiness, responsible AI, to actually characteristics that could be measured, addressing the question of what to measure, and then work with the community, definitely internationally and globally, because we cannot afford to have fragmented market. Work on the measurement and tools for doing that. And then we also need to worry about, I think most of the NIST work is to build that measurement science, but then beyond that, there's the questions of how to make these evaluations and tests scalable for all of the different applications of the AI. So I just want to make that observations about the reason we at NIST and a lot of other part of the US, you see that talking about the voluntary, it's just that simply when it comes to the AI, particularly these foundation models, there is a lot that we want to know that we don't. And we really need to work together to build the knowledge, the network, the community to better understand this. I said that there is a lot that we want to know that we don't know, and I think the operative word there is we, and that we is a larger community of technology developers, the community that study the impact of the technology, sociologists, psychologists, law scholars, all to sort of figure out how this technology is going to change our society, the laws that we need, and building the scientific underpinning for those.
Amazing. Elam, I want to pick up on that. A lot of your work has really centered on this issue of trust and the public, I guess Canada would call it social license, to be able to develop these technologies. And there is a sort of fear factor for people who just, it sounds scary. How do we cultivate trust in the U.S. system? And I'm going to ask you, Mark, about the Canadian approach to cultivating trust.
Yeah, thank you. So right. So you want to call it trust and trustworthy, confidence, safe, secure, all of these words. I think our approach, and I mentioned that it's a long tradition at NIST to work on cultivating trust in technology. Our approach, again, coming from the lens of the measurement science, is first unpack this topic of what do we mean by trust. What are the characteristics that we want to see in AI systems to be trustworthy? So we address that as part of the development of the AI RMF. We reach out to the community, as I said, a very diverse and inclusive community, to kind of hear from the community what are those characteristics that we want to see. Very briefly, in AI, RMF talks about 7 characteristics: valid and reliable, safe, secure and resilient, privacy enhanced, interpretable and explainable, fair with harmful bias managed, and accountable and transparent. And then it provides, let me just say it in the parentheses, that when we did this, UC Berkeley, basically, there was a lot of really good document that were talking about what are the trustworthiness characteristics. And a nice thing is that a researcher at UC Berkeley basically did a mapping of 100 or so papers that are talking about trustworthiness characteristics to the 7 characteristics. So we got a really good reception from the community on those. So that was the first step, but the second step is to come up with a shared understanding of what each of these things means. And this becomes particularly important because, as I said, AI is a multidisciplinary, and we are bringing people that are computer scientists, lawyers, psychologists, and each of them, we may think that terms such as risk bias had dictionary definitions, and we all know what it means, but no, the different community come in with the different interpretations of this word. So we work with the community on sort of coming with a shared understanding of each of this term. That gives us a sort of a better grounding on exactly what it is that we want to measure, and we have been working with the community on building methods and metrics for measurement of these characteristics. That part of the measurement is really important. So knowing what you want to see is one thing, and then testing and assuring that the system is actually having those characteristics is the most important part. But it's also very complicated and complex. NIST, you mentioned that I've been NIST for a long time. That shows my age, but and I've been doing a lot of that's fine. And I've been involved in a lot of evaluations of the technology for biometric. I have watched my colleagues doing the evaluations of the search engines and information retrieval. The work that they did goes back before even Google existed. So we were thinking about all of these things in a long term. But why it comes to the AI is difficult. Because in all of those stances that we did the evaluation, some of you may be familiar with the face recognition test that we do. For all of those tests, we could get the system, the model, the technology, bring it into the laboratory, feed the test data through, get the results, do analysis, and then say, hey, something about the accuracy and reliability. This is not going to give us the full picture for AI, because AI is more than, as you pointed out about people, more than just data, compute, and algorithm, a complex interactions of data, compute, and algorithm with the environment, with the human that operates it or being impacted with that. So those type of model testing that we do in the laboratory setting is while important, to gives us an understanding of the limits and capabilities of the algorithm, what the algorithm is capable to do, is not going to give us the full picture of the risk and impact of the system. So this is what we are currently doing. A lot of our time is being spent on figuring out how to expand that spectrum to also include testing or stress testing that allows us to figure out what are those capabilities can result in risk, what type of risk can materialize from those capabilities. Red teaming, probably have heard, can address some of those, and then augment that with testing that allows us to understand the impact when those risks materialized in the real application. So those are field testing. That was a long answer to say that how we are trying to do this is by unpacking the concept, basically giving names to the things that needs to be measured, come up with definitions for them, and build methods and metrics for the measurement of this. And it's, again, I want to emphasize what Mark said. It's really important, and that's what we're doing, to do this in lockstep with global community and work with the whole community on all of this.
Mark, how's it managed in Canada?
Yeah, I won't profess to try and get into the kind of detailed standards work that I think is so important and that Elam's already kind of highlighted, but there's a corollary effort that needs to happen both at an international governance level and at a domestic governance level, some of which is already happening in both contexts. And so Canada is committed to that same detailed work around both establishing the appropriate standards and then, as we think through our Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, getting crunchier and crunchier about what it means to actually be a high-impact AI system and what actually might then follow through in terms of obligations on the regulatory side. But I would take a step back and say that standards and kind of clear guardrails are one important contributor to trust. And certainly having them in place is one way in which we get citizens to understand the value of artificial intelligence and the fact that there are appropriate rule sets in place. But I think we'd be naive if we didn't note that we're coming into an AI revolution at the time of extraordinarily low trust, where there is extraordinary reticence on the part of citizens to both buy into institutional structures and to actually believe that which they're engaging with. And artificial intelligence has contributed to that and is also has to engage with that in certain ways. And so I think if we think about the more fundamental aspects of how we need to build trust, some of that is absolutely let's focus on standards, let's focus on rules, let's focus on really important guardrails and backstops. The other is let's combat harm. So let's actually make sure that the most negligent uses of the technology, which have the capacity to be able to undermine any sense of trust, are actually both identified, that they are noted as to where they're coming from, so that we can actually have an attribution framework that lets people know where some of this is actually occurring. I always say that we're sort of one algorithmic error away from kind of a generation of kind of data Luddites, of folks who will keep their personal information under their mattress in the same way that folks did on their cash. And I think we have to therefore be very clear with our citizens about the degree to which there are harmful actors who are actually utilizing this technology for ill. The other is I think we need way more positive use cases. We have many instances of folks either with marginal value use cases, super fun ones that potentially are really interesting, but drawings of people or potentially new poems, written in the style of Donald Duck, telling you about your constitution, that's fun, but probably not the most valuable. And so I think we actually need to get folks to a place in which they understand the ways in which algorithms and AI technologies can actually meaningfully improve their lives, both in terms of productivity gains or in terms of some of the ways in which it can actually get to new treatments or new value. And then I think literacy and demystification is actually an incredibly important piece here. We often hear about AI as a black box. I actually think we need to understand AI as a false monolith that is engaging with our citizens. It's this big unknown thing that happens. We actually hear constantly in conversations all the time. I have people talk to me about the AI. It's the AI that's doing it, or they've given it to the AI. I think we need to break that down for folks and understand that both the technology is not monolithic. It is actually multifold. It's actually multiple techniques and approaches happening. It is not all the things that people accrue it to be. And I think helpfully helping people understand the nature of the technology with positive use cases and appropriate backstops and appropriate attribution of actual harm hopefully gets us to a space in a very trust-averse kind of environment that people actually think of this as a potential opportunity rather than just a big scary thing. So.
I loved a phrase you used, Ellen, regulatory or regulation agnostic. I thought that was a very nice phrase. And here we try to be partisan politics agnostic because Congress charters us and we don't want to upset anybody. But can you both talk a little bit about the challenge of working with lawmakers and legislators who are trying, as you said at one point broadly, but trying to intervene in this space because they feel public pressure to do something, and they're getting involved in this space maybe with less time and scholarship than both of you have brought to your work. How do we work with our legislatures in this very sort of dawn of the rulemaking process? And are there initiatives that you already have to try to bridge that gap and understanding?
I'm happy to start. So I think this again kind of finds itself into a broader context. I'd say for Canada, our Westminster model has been under pressure for some time to be able to think through how to meaningfully attack the issues of the day in a structure that's not set up to be nimble, is not necessarily set up to be extraordinarily delegatory in the sense that it wants all of the responsibility at the highest level possible. The generalized approach to legislation making and norm setting is that you ideally put in concrete the least amount possible or necessary to be able to achieve your end, and you give yourself the most amount of flexibility where possible. And so that means your legislation is ideally framework or generalized. You then rely heavily on regulation if that's the kind of appropriate space. But even more so, you probably do things like certification, standards, guidance, and then get down to kind of norms and ethics as potentially a zone where you might be able to spend an awful lot of time. Having, over the course of my public service career, shepherded through a few dozen legislative initiatives, I'd say the pressure from lawmakers and the openness to trusting that the regulation process will get it right, and to having to tell them that it's going to come later and that this is what they're passing now, they're giving regulation making authority. The desire to trust that it'll all come together well is not high. And so it definitely places pressure on the notion that much of this then either has to live in legislation or is pressured to be understood at the time of passage of legislation, which is not how regulation actually works. And so I think there's antidotes, which are generalized literacy, some of the things you can think about in advance, giving things to third parties, giving things to trusted processes to say, hey, these folks say that this is the best thing that we need to do. That can help so that you can actually arrive at a sweet spot that is not kind of knee-jerk codifying in law things that ideally would be far more agile and far more nimble, especially as it relates to a technology like AI.
Ellen?
Yeah, I think we all agree that the speed of advancements in AI has outpaced any effort in policy, regulation, standard testing, right? We are all, once I mentioned that we are all sprinting a marathon, never-ending marathon. So I go back to say that there's a lot that we need to know that we don't know, and I think that has been the biggest challenge. And I think what I heard Mark saying is that we want to be nimble, put the right safeguards there, but also making sure that innovations is not stifled. So one thing I will say is that this is some of the questions I used to get when I testified, that do we need to regulate the technology in a horizontal way, regulating AI, or regulating the vertical applications? And you ask about, precedences, and when you look at, for example, the FDA model, that there are criteria established, then the companies will go do the testing and submit the result of the testing to FDA, and then scientists, scholars, researchers, people at FDA will look at it and review this, say that, okay, maybe that model works. But then you think about the broad interdisciplinary nature of AI, you think that FDA works because FDA is just doing what is FDA mission space. So can it be generalized to regulating the horizontal? So that's something that has been discussed a lot. Again, going back to the AI-RMF, that the work that we did, we decided to kind of address it in a hybrid horizontal and vertical approach, where the horizontal sort of set the common grounds or common rule for AI across all of the different disciplines. For example, we want the same definition of bias, for example, for every applications. But how it manifests or may manifest may be different for finance versus HR versus health. And there might be different laws and regulations already on the book for each of the spaces. So I think, I'm not giving a good answer, but I'm just trying to say that it just needs a lot of different inputs from different people and trying to figure out what to do. There's a lot in AI that's new that the old past experiences may not readily work, but there's also a lot that we can learn from past experiences to apply.
When dealing with complexity, completeness is not a fair standard because there's just so much that's out there. So I think you're doing fine. Let me turn now to our audience if there's anyone who wants to ask a question. We have a limited amount of time, so we'll take a couple questions together. And we've got charming young people on either side. So there's the gentleman here in the gray, and then the young lady on the end, and then I'll come to the gentleman here in the blue. Yes? Okay, good. So Zane, come down there. Okay, sir.
Hi, good morning, thank you. And returning to the definition topic earlier, and then apologize for a very semantic, abstract question, but in working in this space, how do you think about what is intelligence? I'm good on the artificial part, but that intelligence part of AI, it seems we have a proliferation of definitions and fundamentally a rethinking of what is intelligence. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of your AI work. How is intelligence defined? What are the key definitions around that shape what you're doing?
Question from the young lady.
Good morning. My question, so I actually recently attended the World Bank and IMF meetings, and one of their panels was talking about how AI in certain countries, especially smaller economies, has helped their financial systems and getting countries like Rwanda to 92% in financial literacy. But the biggest problem in certain economies is the fact that nobody knows what the cloud is or how the cloud is being regulated. So I guess my biggest question is, from a national security standpoint, what direction the U.S. and Canada are looking towards in terms of regulating the cloud.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And then the gentleman here.
My question is in context of the trust and a marketplace that is afraid of AI, is there an emerging score or identifier that might reveal to the public some credibility of the tool or tools that are being used? I'm thinking browsers tell us if they're safe or not. Buildings have hazmat placards with codes and diamonds and colors. But it seems like that might be a safe space to start to report the elements that are emerging.
Excellent. So 3 very good questions. I leave it to you. Who wants to volunteer?
I quickly address the last question. Great point. In AI RMF lingo, we call them transparency. So the more information you provide at the right level to the right person, it helps with sort of building trust. And we have several publications on how, there's the issue of the cognitive bias also comes in, how people process information, what they need, how people trust something that's there. But examples that you just mentioned, that if there is a AI-generated content, can there be a logo or something there to sort of label that? That's something that's being studied. There is whole sets of the concerns and issues with the labeling, make sure that the label is trustworthy, making sure that the right information is being conveyed. But just want to let you know that conversation is going on. So in general, yes to transparency, yes to more disclosure. It's important too that it's just not a overflow of the information. It needs to be the right information for the right the audience. If anybody had a chance to look at the AI RMF playbook, for each of the recommendations in AI RMF, we have a section specifically talk about how to be transparent about this and what type of documentations and reporting is needed. I personally think that one of the things that we need standard for is a interoperable, harmonized way of disclosures and transparency. And I'm sure you have heard about model cards, data sheets for data sets. Those are a good way for the model developer to come out and say what they had done. What we had seen in the past few years is that the model card is becoming thinner and thinner. So we learn less and less about them. Cloud regulations completely out of my knowledge space. So I don't know about cloud regulations. Intelligence is a absolutely tricky thing to try to define. As you mentioned, not the definition of intelligence, but the definitions of artificial general intelligence has been a moving post, and the definitions keep changing. What we did with AI-RMF, and we actually learned it from several others outside, including OECD, is instead of defining artificial intelligence, something that the community was not able to define since the term was coined back in summer of 1956, define artificial intelligence systems. So narrow it to systems, and because, again, our focus was risk assessments and risk measurement. And we built off of there has been many definitions for artificial intelligence systems. We built off of the previous works, particularly the OECD, and OECD sort of adopted our definitions. But I personally think that the definitions of artificial intelligence is a difficult and sort of never-ending game.
And I'll just add, because Washington is terrible for these things, you mentioned the AI-RMF, that's the
Oh,
AI Regulatory Management Framework?
Risk management.
Risk Management Framework,
Sorry.
okay. For those of you watching online. Mark?
So great questions, and I'll try and tackle two of them together and one separately. So on scoring AI and verification mechanisms, I think the goal is a shared one. I think getting to kind of I was going to say blue check mark, although that's probably contested territory in some zones. But getting to verifiable mechanisms to actually kind of build trust is certainly a goal. I think the challenge in artificial intelligence is a couplefold. One is you can't standardize what is not common practice, and so in spaces where we're literally still kind of working out some of the technical work that actually underpins the usage of the technology, you don't start with a standard. You start with a standard once you've got a generalized common understanding of what the appropriate application is. We've done that at principles level. Now trying to do that at evaluation level and actually at testing level, I think is the effort that's underway. And then I think we'll have to continue to work with how do we actually then get to interoperability of some of those verifiabilities, because what we don't want is kind of 19 different kind of versions of some sort of verifiable status. And I'd say, that is a shared zone where we are committed to continuing to work with our U.S. colleagues, and I think that's ideally the goal that we get to, both from the Safety Institute side in terms of evaluation science on some of the highest risks, but then also on some of the standards actually for things like transparency, bias, and discrimination. On the definition of intelligence and on the regulation of cloud, I know it doesn't seem like they'd go together, but I'd actually put them together to say, I think in both cases, we're quite keen on making sure that we have appropriate guardrails and safeguards and legislation obligations on impacts. And I'd say that's true both in terms of the definition of intelligence and on kind of what we're doing about cloud, which is our legislative approach, for instance, and even our voluntary guide talks about artificial intelligence systems and high impact systems. Rather than trying to kind of have a parsimonious debate about what constitutes intelligence or not, it's what is it doing and what is its ultimate impact? And then very similarly about cloud, we're kind of coming at that in two ways. What is the function of the actual activity with the data that's being held, and what is it being used for? I think cloud brings an additional perspective, which is where is the actual fundamental and foundational compute housed, and where are some of the considerations around that. We've had long conversations around compute development. In that, I think we need to be thoughtful about where we place high performance compute capabilities, thinking about their dual use nature, and making sure that they're actually in the hands of countries that we have strong solidarity with and alignment with. And at the same time, I think we continue to think about how do you actually get at the ultimate impact of either the data holding or of the general of the intelligence, artificial intelligence high impact system, and think from an impacts perspective. And it's worth noting that our laws in many cases are agnostic, not regulatorily agnostic, but agnostic to some of the actual kind of manifestations of the data or of the system. If you're playing with personal information of Canadians, it doesn't matter what systems you're using to do it. You're obligated to follow the laws of the Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join me in thanking Alam Tabbasi and Mark Shan for a great Flagside chat. You started us very well. I'm going to turn now to what's the man that some of you know has been behind the scenes running this entire program, Senior Research Associate Xavier Delgado. Over to you, Xavier.
Thank you, Chris. Can we get one more round of applause for our great fireside chat? So for those of you who haven't been to a Wilson Center conference before, the way this works is they need somebody to introduce the moderator and the head honchos on the next panel. And I've been told they usually go for the young, wittiest, handsomest staffer that they can find around. And he wasn't available, so you're all stuck with me. Folks, it's a real pleasure to be hosting the second annual Canada-US Legal Symposium, especially because we get to work with our great colleagues at the Canada-US Law Institute. And to that end, I'm very pleased to be introducing the moderator for our next panel, Mr. Stephen Paley. He's the head of compliance risk assessment at Charles Schwab and the managing director of the Canada-US Law Institute. He'll also be joined on the panel by Mr. Stephen Burns of Bennett Jones LLP, Ms. Jamie Simpson of the Council for Innovation Promotion, and Ms. Heather West of Venable LLP. Please give them a warm welcome.
Does feel like a TV studio up here. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first panel. Looking forward to a great discussion on IP, copyright, and AI. But before we get started, and I'll introduce our esteemed panelists here, just wanted to give everyone a couple key questions to think about, some legal principles and considerations to think about, and some consequences to think about as we look at this topic, and a very fascinating and evolving area. But first is, how does copyright, patent, trademark infringement apply to AI creations? I guess the general question, can AI be patented? There's a lot of interesting discussions on this topic, particularly within the arts. But it goes to many different industries as well. I just read an article the other day that Bank of America has increased AI 94% in terms of their patent applications since 2022. So it's impacting many different industries, so important to think about. The second thing is, who owns the content? What about right of use? Using unlicensed data to have AI learn or in its training. And also, what about privacy concerns? So these are all important things to think about in this space. From a legal principle and considerations perspective, there's the term unauthorized derivative works. Are they insufficiently transformative? That's one thing to think about in this discussion. The fair use doctrine comes up in terms of, is the AI based in criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research? And then from a contract law perspective, how do contracts speak to generative AI usage? This is obviously very important consequentially. There can be hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages for each instance of knowing use of or inappropriate use of unlicensed information. There's also, AI could share confidential trade secrets or business information unintentionally that's used from the learning process. Also, what is the onus on the content and data creators as they and inventors, I guess, as they go through this process? How are the creators being compensated for licensed information? How is this impacting business models? This might be beyond the scope of this conversation a little bit, but as companies continue to utilize AI, how is that impacting the way that they do business, and how their business models are structured? And then from a contract perspective, was talked about in the last panel, but as well, but disclosures to ensure IP rights are understood, indemnification, things of that nature from a contract law perspective. So with that, I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists here, and I'm actually going to go at the end first, back to here. So we have Stephen Burns from Bennett Jones. He's a partner, co-head of innovation, technology, and branding practice. And his practice focuses on energy, utility, and infrastructure-related technology, procurement and outsourcing, technology transfers, intellectual property, mergers and acquisitions, and corporate commercial matters related to technology. Stephen has extensive IT procurement-related experience in several industries, including energy and utilities, health, financial markets, and banking. Stephen has significant technology-related experience in connection with engineering, construction, commissioning, operation, debottlenecking, and revamping of energy, utility, and infrastructure facilities. Stephen's practice focuses on information law, including data governance, cybersecurity, seismic, privacy, social media, document retention, and access to government information. And Stephen regularly appears before Canada's various information and privacy commissioners. He advises on matters concerning licensing, registration, and protection of intellectual property in Canada and beyond. And Stephen is also a registered trademark agent. He's regularly recognized for his leading practice, including in Chambers Canada, Legal 500 Canada, the Canadian Legal Expert Dictionary, IAM Patent 1000, and the Best Lawyers in Canada. And regularly lectures and publishes on the topic as well. He earned his HBA from the University of Western Ontario, or Western as we talked about before, his LLB from University of Manitoba, and MBA from University of Calgary. Next, we have Jamie Simpson. Thank you for joining us. She is Chief Policy Officer and Counsel for the Council for Innovation Promotion, C4IP, to use the acronym. Jamie has almost 20 years of experience in policy and a specific focus on IP-related issues. She previously served as Chief Counsel on the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Courts, IP, and the Internet, Counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee while on detail from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and Associate Solicitor at the USPTO. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School and previously a law clerk at the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Simpson has extensive experience in intellectual property law and policy, as well as an earlier background working on patent litigation and licensing disputes. Welcome, Jamie. And then last but not least, Heather West, the Senior Director of Cybersecurity and Privacy Services at Venable. She's a policy and tech translator, product consultant, and long-term digital strategist, guiding the intersection of emerging technology, culture, governments, and policies. She has degrees in computer and cognitive science and focuses on data governance, data security, artificial intelligence, and privacy in the digital age. She's a subject matter authority who has written extensively about AI and other data-driven topics for over a decade, and also a member of the Washington Post, The Network, which is a group of high-level digital security experts selected to weigh in on pressing cybersecurity issues. She has led standards and policy efforts around emerging technologies throughout her career and regularly collaborates with stakeholders and policymakers in Washington and with global product and policy teams to help steer the conversation on the role of AI in society and its impact on privacy and security. And she previously served as a director of the privacy policy team at one of the world's largest social technology companies. All right, so welcome everyone to our first panel. I think maybe to get us started, and maybe start with Heather, kind of at the intersection of this topic and just from a historical development perspective, how you've seen this area develop historically, and also the same question from a legal perspective as well to our other panelists.
Sure, thank you. Is this on? Yeah, okay. I can't tell, that's always weird and creepy. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for having me. As Stephen noted, I am not a lawyer, I am a technologist. And so I'll say that up front. Although I have many opinions about the legal side of this, they are not informed by the same expertise that Jamie and Steve have. But I come at this, as my bio says, as a translator, because I'm fascinated by the way that these technologies are evolving. And they have been evolving. I think over the last 2 years, it's been really obvious to everyone that this is new, this is interesting, this is something novel, and we're not quite able to put our hands around it. I love that the question for Elham and Mark about definitions, because what is intelligence? We don't have a good definition. But we do know that we're coming up with cooler and cooler ways of making or simulating intelligence. The term itself comes from back in the 1950s. So this isn't a new idea. These technologies are relatively old, but at the time they were really simple too. And we had chatbots. The one that I played with a lot decades ago was called Eliza, and it did a really good job of kind of interacting with you in the same way that like a sympathetic ear or a therapist might. How does that make you feel? What do you think about that? And it would ask you leading questions, and then you would chat back into the little text box, and that was really cool. It felt really sophisticated. Obviously, we are so far past that now. And that progress over decades has led us to this focus on data. And that focus on data is absolutely fascinating. And I do think that it has changed over the last few years because of the progress in these AI technologies. And when I say AI, I'm generally talking about these advanced models, not always generative, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, that's the interesting example. The idea that you can create something new and generate something new from these systems. But data has always been the secret to all of these technologies, digitally, and everything in the back end was data and algorithms and compute, and you put them together and you get AI. Suddenly LLMs have put that at the forefront. And I think Mark was talking about digital Luddites and the potential for creating digital Luddites. People are looking at this and saying, wait a second, how do I feel about that? I'm not sure. The fact that this chatbot just wrote me an incredible poem or lent a sympathetic ear that really felt very human, felt very creative, has changed the way we think about it. And so suddenly the way that we're thinking about data, because of how we have trained these models on incredibly broad data sets, is really important. And so we've got these questions of how do we think about training data? What is an appropriate use for these giant data sets? And they are giant, they're incredible. But also, how do we think about what data is fair as input data? As we are thinking about how, should I put this in and ask a question about it? Should I put sensitive data into a chatbot? Should I use, this data set that maybe I don't own? There are pieces and questions there. And then really for this panel, the one that I have not been thinking about nearly as long is the output data. Do I own that? Can I protect it? And so we've got this training data, this input data, and this output data that has really changed the conversation about data collection and data ownership. I come at this from a history of kind of data security and data privacy, and now suddenly data ownership has jumped to the forefront in a way that I think is really interesting over the last, longer than 2 years, but the last 2 years have certainly accelerated it.
Well, thanks, and thank you all for having me here. And I guess I would say, in contrast to Heather, I'm not a technologist, I'm a lawyer. And
perfect team.
And what you realize if you've decided to go into intellectual property law is that you need to be prepared to learn new technology and try and figure out how the law is going to adapt to these changing circumstances. And AI may be one of the biggest waves that we've seen, and it all came upon us, at least from my perspective, pretty quickly. And it kind of came up in the sense of, on the one hand, I think you see a lot of creators suddenly realize that their content was part of training sets, probably without their knowledge and probably without their consent. And kind of being forced into a conversation of, at least in the United States, you're supposed to have an exclusive right in your works. whatever a court may do in terms of finding whether this was fair use, they didn't really have a chance to have their day in court before it was already taken. So, that's clearly the subject of a lot of court cases. On the flip side, you have a very interesting and ongoing discussion about who owns the output, as Heather mentioned. And we've seen this in the United States play out both in the copyright space and the patent space. Very similar lines of inquiry from the agencies to kind of put out directives to creators using these technologies on when they can get a copyright or when they can get a patent. But there's kind of a catch on that in the way our system works, in that these agencies don't actually have lawmaking authority. That has to come from Congress or from the courts, who haven't spoken definitively on either one of these issues. So you kind of have a strange situation where the Patent Office, for example, has put out regulations at this point that patent examiners are following. The Copyright Office has done the same thing. But it's not clear that courts are ultimately going to adopt this system. And I think many might say that a really complicated policy issue like this is best addressed by Congress, who can weigh all of these equities. But as you may be aware of our Congress, it tends to move pretty slowly. And when I was in Congress, I saw this very directly working in the copyright space. Sound recordings were technologically created around the early 1900s. Congress didn't pass a right to have copyright in sound recording as opposed to other types of copyrights until 1972. And that led to other loopholes that we only fixed about 5 years ago in Congress. So, thinking that Congress might solve all of this right away is probably wishful thinking. On the other hand, there have been a lot of really interesting bills introduced, and I think some things that have come up in public media, such as the use of people's voices, I think has gotten a lot of attention, and maybe some of it will be addressed more quickly. Which is to say, having talked to people from a business sense, there's a lot of uncertainty. From creators, both who want to protect their works and use these exciting new technologies to make new works, there are a lot of unanswered questions. And as a lawyer, we're kind of stuck in this gray area of trying to provide guidance, which is, an exciting time, makes conversations like this very important. And I'll leave it there for now.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. I think I'm bringing both a legal voice but also the Canadian voice, and I'll try not to make too many maple syrup jokes. We do have a strategic national reserve, and we're very proud of it. I think it's also from the context, and I think just pulling on what Jamie said, that recognizing that we are a small but mighty trading partner here with our U.S. colleagues, it highlights the intersection in the value chain between regulation and opportunity from a commercial's perspective. We spend a lot of time, and we'll spend time talking today about the rights of creators and copyright and how that impacts, but it's only a very small, narrow subset of all of the data that we're talking about and how we're trying to figure out as commercial enterprises, how do we use our data to improve our value chain? Because that's really what we're talking about, is within this structure of these new tools, we've broken the language barrier. We now read better in language through a computer than we did as a human. We are now able, there's some good studies out there, to improve the overall quality of communication, where one study was done with Boston Consulting Group. They looked at about 700 consultants, and they looked at them and said, we're going to give you these basic new tools. And the very good ones had about a 10% lift. And I won't get the stats exactly right while I'm standing on a panel. They looked at the middle ones, and they had about a 30% lift in quality. And they looked at the ones who were not performing as well, and they had a 45% lift, so they had of quality. So they were able to start bringing together an improved language understanding, but it's still predictive. It still is only making helping you understand what it thinks is the most likely outcome, which means the same study found that 20% of it was actually harmful by a factor of about 20% when it was dealing with very complicated and unexpected activities. So I want to level set for everyone that what we're really talking about here is data, like money, does not understand boundaries. There is no jurisdictional limit as to where innovation can occur, where data can be housed, or where we can move to better. And what the panel has been talking about both before and now is around how are we looking at the laws of a particular jurisdiction, the US or Canada, or Europe or Asia, picking one of our jurisdictions, how are we bringing those laws forward in harmony in a way that lets us meet our strategic objectives, our national security objectives. But from my perspective, as I don't work in either of those spaces, how are we making this work from a commercial perspective? Because at the end of the day, it's about moving us forward and having the laws and the policies align that bring us forward towards that common objective, which is having a better standard of life driven by an economy that is using the right tools to advance the business chain. And it's that piece that's often lost. We get lost in, we've been doing a review in Canada of what we should do. And we asked in October for submissions. There were 100 submissions. I know the US did one. You had 10,000. It's not about size, it's about the maple syrup. And we were able to, I'm shameless, and I'm going to enjoy that. It's my season, it's our fall colors, you're welcome. And what we really saw, though, was competing economic rights. As you break down all the submissions and you break down these choices, what you're doing is looking at various levels of granularity about differing economic choices and making those economic choices, who has rights and how they're going to play across the various IP rights in the context of the broader economy.
That makes sense. And you know, to your point, like you kind of touched on this, bring it all together. So you talk about adoption rates, you talk about data hoarding, innovation. How have you seen that impact its business's approach to AI? Because there's a lot of things kind of working together, apprehension maybe to adopt, particularly externally, with impact on clients or customers, however it might be, but also not losing the arms race, if you will, to innovate and develop. So interested in your thoughts on how that creates challenges, both legally and not legally as well.
I mean, it's been super interesting. I work with clients who, the most fun part of my job, up until this job, I was in the technology industry. And the most fun part of my job now is that I get to work with clients from all sorts of industries. And they're having exactly this discussion. I want to use that. It looks really useful. Everybody's talking about it. It must be cool. But I don't really understand it. What is it for? How do I get a benefit from it? And so the fun thing is that I'm talking to folks in all these industries, it's healthcare and finance and manufacturing and shipping, and they're asking the same questions because they're looking for those basics, and they're thinking about, well, I have this amazing data, or I can get this amazing data. What could I do with it? How could I use this? And the answer is not usually a chatbot. The answer is usually they can use that data in some new interesting way after they get over this question, this evaluation. And so one of the things I do a lot is helping people think through internal governance for their data and for their AI. And then thinking through what it might be good for, because we've seen a lot of folks slap AI on something, whether it's just marketing or not. Sometimes it's just marketing. And chances are good there is AI in it, but it might not be new or interesting. Or they've decided to stick generative AI in something on the assumption that it will be helpful. And I think a lot of folks are realizing that they need to put more thought into it. Whereas folks who have really thought through how can this iteratively improve my product or my services or my operations are seeing some pretty good results. But it actually requires sitting back and thinking through, here's my data, here's how I augment it, here's how I use it, here's what I'm trying to do with it. It's the really boring side of AI. But that boring side is enabling really interesting uses. And I think watching that dynamic is really interesting.
I would say, some of the responses to the legal gray areas that we have kind of created a market need, and which is being filled by some people who do want to use these exciting tools, but you don't want to have the liability of finding out, 5-10 years from now that there's, massive copyright liability that you, having used the system, are going to also be responsible for. But, there are market solutions to these problems, such as licensing large data sets, and a lot of that does seem to be happening. And then, certain industries, such as the film industry, others can use these kind of more clean AI models in their applications, and there are a lot of exciting ones going on, and they can kind of be sure of the provenance of all of that. So I think in the absence of clear laws, at least here, we do have a lot of innovative private solutions, and I think those are a great way forward. I also wanted to address this kind of issue of a race to the bottom, because I do think that's driving or a kind of national security, because I'm worried that this is causing a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of justifying things that, in the name of national security, without knowing kind of what the ultimate effects are going to be. And I mean, I share these same concerns. I think AI does seem like it's going to be a very powerful tool. I want to see the U.S. and our allies be in control and at the forefront of this. But I think we also have to be careful about what we're sacrificing in the name of doing that. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having.
Look, I completely agree, and I think it's important when I talk with commercial actors about why we're looking at artificial intelligence, we don't start with national security. We don't start with the policy considerations. We don't care. No organization, right-thinking, long-term investing organization plans to do harm. What we are looking to do is take our data and do something better with it so we can either drive out cost or improve profits. So when you think about a pipeline company, we're taking all sorts of data we have on pipeline operations, and we're looking at how we can train an artificial intelligence tool to look at predictive analytics and machine learning and some level of better understanding of that pipeline so we can drive out our maintenance costs and we can reduce the risk of spill. And that's going to have a huge impact for the ability to deliver safer, in a case of pipeline, safer throughput of whatever's in that pipeline out into the marketplace. What we're doing, however, is we're challenging our very fundamental understandings around how do I govern internally, not govern at the corporate level. And I realize I'm at a policy institute and I'm talking about the biggest governance issue we have isn't actually at the national security level. It's about the frameworks for governance that exist within the individual organization. And I'll give you the perfect example I always use is we have traditionally used dollars as a proxy for risk. And we've said if it's a contract that's $10,000, put it on your credit card. If the contract is for $10 million, it goes to a VP. If it's $100 million, it goes to the CEO. What we're talking about now is our data going into these tools that are being provided and commercialized on a model of scalability, access to cloud, where I can get an absolutely free service that will ask for a whole ton of my employees' privacy information or personal information, which will be subject to privacy law in Canada, and put the company at massive risk. It's about controlling the shadow organizations and getting to the transparency, not so much at the level of the AI tool, but the transparency of of what the organization is actually doing. And I think that's driving why we're seeing lower adoption and why we're seeing uncertainty as to what we should do from a policy perspective in IP rights, because the organizations don't know the value, they don't know the business case, and they don't have the controls in place to be able to go forward. And so we're not able to give good guidance to our legislatures, good guidance to our governments as to what we need to succeed. And so from an IP perspective, yes, we've got patents and we have copyrights, both of which are creatures of statute and which are designed to create a social compact, if you will, that in exchange for a monopoly right, I will, disclose my invention or I will publish my materials, and then who should be able to take economic benefit from those disclosures. That's a very narrow issue in the question of intellectual property rights. This is much more about data rights and about data governance, and I think we need to expand our topic to cover those.
And that speaks to the last panel too, in terms of what does a risk management framework look like, and how is that evolving in different organizations. To kind of go on top of that, you talked about kind of the opportunities that AI presents to different companies. It changes the business model as well, and the business framework. Talk about things like onsourcing and things of that nature. So interested in your thoughts on how you're seeing that kind of evolve as you work in these areas in terms of how AI is transforming the way that business models operate and challenges that might come as a result of that.
I think much like risk, it's hard to measure, right? And I do think that to respond a little bit to something that both of you were talking about, we don't know how to measure the value of data. There isn't a concrete way to do it, because it's not as if this piece of data is worth $1. This piece of data is worthless until you put it into a data set that's interesting. Suddenly it's worth a lot. But I think that companies are looking at that balance and saying, well, where is the risk? How do I measure the risk? How do I figure out how to measure the risk? But how do I look to the opportunity, and how do I understand what this might be and how this could really manifest into something amazing? And I do see a lot of folks who are outside of the traditional tech industry. And when we think about AI and we think about all of the biggest tech companies, and we think of startups in Silicon Valley, and we think of folks around the world who are just like jamming at computers all day. But I actually think that opportunity, we're seeing the biggest leaps and bounds on these non-traditional sectors, and the idea that, that we can hook it up to the pipeline. I actually love pipeline as an idea area, as an example, because there's so many very clear, measurable things that you can actually build that AI for. Is there a leak? What is the throughput? How clean is it? Yada, yada. And you can actually build that out in a way that I think it's very hard. You were talking about artists, to quantify some of those other pieces around this data. My favorites are when you take an identified problem instead of saying, I want to use AI. You take an identified problem and you realize that AI can be applied to it, and maybe it's agriculture. I think there's some really interesting smart agriculture AI out there that is just so far from your first impression of AI but it's leaps and bounds, and they're measuring in these huge percentages of what the improvement looks like. What's the yield? What's the rate of disease, and really getting incredibly smart on how we're applying this. There is huge opportunity in the big tech sector too, but we've been quietly using AI. I say we because I came from that sector, quietly using AI in the background for a long time, and suddenly it's new and interesting and kind of sexy. In a way, like no one was talking about AI. AI was kind of a scary phrase, and it's still a little bit of a scary phrase, but I think people have seen the opportunity, to your question, in a much more concrete way, because we've all gotten to play with it a little bit. And it's, my microwave is AI. It's like my favorite example. You hit the button, it uses sensor inputs to understand whether my dinner is reheated, and it stops when it's done. That's AI. It's got an input, it's got a sensor, it's got an output, it affects the behavior of something. Nobody's excited about that. It's just part of our day-to-day lives. On the other hand, if I can go in and ask a chatbot a really thorny question, and I do this, I will ask these chatbots for something that I just don't have search terms for. And it's really a great tool. I asked about a poem that was like, I think it's about this thing, it's a patient in a hospital and this and that. It says, I think that you might mean this poem. Now, really interestingly, the bot that I asked also said, I'm not going to quote it for you because copyright law, which is a new safeguard that they've put in. And so the big tech companies are iterating and thinking about these things and really moving forward quickly as well, but it actually feels much less concrete to me than the other sectors and where the opportunities are found there.
Yeah, and speaking of some of those other sectors, some of the concrete ways that this has kind of come up in the patent space is also in industries that have been kind of more quietly using AI for a long time. The pharmaceutical industry, drug discovery is a great example. And interestingly, while they've been doing that, kind of the regulations that came out about when you can patent something in terms of how much AI you've used, came out this year. And one of the rules, basically says if you use too much AI, the AI is essentially kind of an inventor, and you may not be able to get a patent on it because patents can only be given to humans. Again, this is not clear that the courts are going to require this exact interpretation, but that's kind of what the agency is requiring. And that's, raised a lot of questions. Kind of looking at the drug discovery space, that's kind of the law in terms of using AI, but if you go back, 50, 60 years, scientists were doing just chemical experiments, throwing things into a black box, getting out interesting compounds. They didn't know exactly how they got them, but they could patent them. And, my question is, why is using AI so much different if a human scientist, recognizes the value of what the AI has output and identified as potentially intriguing? And I think another question that many people have raised is, how do you know when AI triggers these requirements? How is it different than just a regular use of a computer that people have been using all the time? And I guess that's where, I kind of have a concern that I think there's a good instinct to try and get a handle on AI and to have some guardrails around it. But there's also, as true with any regulation, the risk of just going too far too quickly and chilling the use of AI, which is, one of the things that I think many and our organization thinks this regulation has the risk of doing. And in terms of more generally kind of bolstering our national security, our national competitiveness, there's a real question on why are we hindering people who want to use AI in these creative ways by putting, what may not be legally required limits on who can get a patent. And, I'm kind of oversimplifying things here, but just to kind of put all these ideas out here, these are really thorny questions, but ones that we really need to grapple with and hopefully try and get the balance right.
And I'm just going to build on that, Jamie, which is investment craves certainty, right? If you're going to make, and we're talking about very expensive tools. There was an estimate, and I'm just going to repeat an estimate that I heard at a conference, whether it's right or not, I'll take the abuse later, that to be able to train one of the large language models, you need access to a very large and expensive supercomputer running at about $100 million for the rental time for the couple of months it takes, and you're running on a power consumption of about $150 million. So the number that was put forward in this public space was $250 million. I have not certified or verified that number, but I think it's important to understand that we are at a point when we have a tool that has broken the language barrier and now reads better. It's still predictive. It's not accurate. It is predictive. It's not computational. There are limitations which are inherent to the technology, and we are all struggling with how that's going to improve our value chain. And so we need certainty in all of those value chains. In the large energy utility space, I'm not really focused on what's happening in the creative space. I'm not focused on what's happening in the pharmacy science space, although the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was just awarded for being able to rapidly accelerate the speed at which we can handle understanding proteins better. That all drives us to certainty. And what it drives is these conversations, these panels, these structures, to start looking at industry to figure out what we want to do, to look at how we're going to use it safely, to look at the tool makers. And this is my call out of, and very Canadian, could we please lose some of the Silicon Bro element of I have to prove I did it first and be loud about it, and I'll worry about how I got there. And maybe we could start building where I could adopt it, because it was built in a way that was on layers and layers and layers of trust and certainty and transparency, so I could actually make it commercially viable and do something useful with it. There's lots of elements here that need to be worked through, and I'm very thankful I'm not in the policy space. If I go back to the patent side, I'll also just flag, just to keep the conversation going, patents are often thought of as offensive, defensive, and neutral. And sometimes you're patenting to stop others to be able to get a patent that's going to make your life more expensive. You see a lot of that in some industries. Sometimes you're doing it because you can commercialize that patent at great expense, the pharmacy side. And sometimes you're neutral to it because you're an academe. And a whole bunch of patents are going out because it's a way to publish to show that you're bringing value to what you're doing. AI has created an ability to take diverse data sets and bring them together in ways that haven't been thought about. And AI is now being weaponized to impact the patent space, to say, I'm going to set an AI to start creating every possible thing and then publish it so I can start taking apart what's prior art and damaging the ability to patent an entire area. So I think there's more than just rights on the creator, non-creator, but also the social compact itself has to be reviewed to see where that's going.
Yeah, very good. I want to open it up for questions here in a minute. Maybe one last thing to comment on really quickly, I guess kind of moving forward and what's next. Is thinking through this, and you're talking about gray areas in the law and everything. I got to thinking back to the music kind of download days and a lot of the uncertainty that kind of goes around there. And using that as an example, just, are there lessons learned from other things that might be able to apply to these gray areas? And then kind of what do you all think is next, or what's ahead in this space?
Nice, easy question.
I like to give the easy ones at the end.
Right. I think there's a huge amount, we've been talking about all of the opportunity. The lessons learned are actually a piece that we skipped over in the immediate excitement about some of these AI technologies, and we're getting to them. But I think music downloads are a good example. I also think that I come from the cybersecurity and privacy space, and so how we treated data over the last 20 years and how we thought about data had to evolve. And there's a bunch of lessons there too, and that does get to data ownership in an interesting and different way. But I do think that we need to look at this and think about potentially different frames, not 100% different, like 90% the same, and 10% different for this new use. And to Jamie's point, this system takes a little while to adapt, and we can make that a feature or a bug. But thinking about what did we have to adapt before? How did it work? How did we create these mechanisms to move the space forward before legislation could do so, and come up with things that really benefit all of the sides when you're talking about that legal transaction and that business interaction. How do we make this less adversarial and more cooperative? And how do we do that at the national security level too? There was a national security memo late last week that's talked a lot about let's be collaborative and cooperative and work with our allies to move this all forward. And I do think that all of the policy questions we're talking about and legal questions on the IP side are going to impact that discussion in that international discussion, that U.S.-Canada discussion, but also all of our other allies, as we figure out where those lessons are. They're not all going to be from the U.S. as much as our government might think they are, and coming out and learning those lessons and coming up with something that actually works for everybody. I'm like this eternal optimist, can you tell? But learning those lessons from any number of them. I don't have the really concrete ideas for where those lessons are from IP law, so I'll end there.
I've thought a lot about this from an IP perspective, and I think copyright is a really interesting lens to look at this in particular. And one of the things that I guess kind of struck me is that if you kind of look at some of the more recent experience in the U.S. With the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, for example, it was passed in the late 90s. And I think you saw all of the leading court cases be very deferential to the then young technology industry as it was growing. kind of, from some copyright owners' perspective, really weakening copyright, making things harder for the copyright owner. And I think those precedents have kind of set the stage for what we've seen happen in AI, the willingness of some companies to take huge risks. And, it just occurs to me that if you're a court getting a very concrete case, do you want to be the lone individual to say, I am going to say no to this new industry? Without all of the policy tools that Congress or, other policymakers would have. And I think there are just a lot of practical reasons when the law doesn't give you a really clear answer, that judges are going to, not want to be the ones to say no. Which is to say, I think in the U.S., we really need to look to our other branches of government and kind of taking a step, higher than that. I think as a country, we also need to recognize if we don't figure out how to act more quickly, other jurisdictions are going to do it. And because as Stephen said, data doesn't know boundaries, we're going to be following other people's laws. If they're laws of our allies, they might at least kind of reflect our values. But, if we want to kind of be at the stage participating in the agenda, we kind of need to make our systems work a little faster. How we do that is more of a challenge. I don't know that I have the answers, but I think it's really one of our national imperatives that we figure that out.
Right. And I sort of summarize that because I think it's a very important piece of the discussion is intellectual property becomes a non-tariff trade barrier. And it really becomes a question about where are we putting the moat around what markets and what access to those markets and how we're going to enable one of those tool set to drive that investment and that certainty, both from the safety and protection of our citizens, but also for our businesses on the investments that they're making. Much like privacy was used as a non-tariff trade barrier. I want to just sort of round up as we go to the questions with the statement that, because I think it's really important we come back to that as well, is not all data is good. Think about it. ChatGPT was taught on the internet. That is a terrifying statement about bias and access. And I always like to make sure before we sort of come out of these sort of policy discussions that we remind people, AI is not magic. It is an opportunity to find very high-speed computational activities to find relationships that we don't understand. There are so many that are identified, we don't understand what they all are. And if you hear one of the medical team from Mayo come out and talk about their experience with teaching an AI to be able to determine skin cancer. And it's a great example, but it's worth reminding people that data is garbage until you understand it, and the relationships are garbage unless you understand it. And in that case, and I'm just going to paraphrase as it was told to me, the Mayo went out and went through a whole very complicated process to build up a data set to begin to identify when a mole was likely to be cancerous. And what they discovered is that it was getting really good at identifying when moles were going to be cancerous because there was a ruler in the photos when moles were likely to be cancerous because the dermatologist was measuring it, compared to other mole photos which didn't have that correlation and didn't necessarily have the ruler in measuring it. So the whole activity failed. We're at a new stage of technology. There is risk in this. And one of the reasons you're seeing high levels of adoption in industries like finance and insurance around cybersecurity, around transactional verification, they've been in that space for 20 or 30 years, is because they've got a very good understanding of the data and what they want to achieve in it. Where we're finding terrible results is, and we've all seen the cases, is when lawyers ask the general language model to do their legal research, and it creates cases because it hallucinates, it's predictive. It doesn't know anything. And so from a policy perspective, my cry out is it's just a tool. Look at your value chain, understand where it's going to be, and understand that value chain both in your corporate, national, and international context. And then we can start having a conversation with our policymakers about how to create that certainty and how to effectively use a non-tariff trade barrier to create a playing field that will ultimately improve our citizens' lives.
yeah, data integrity, obviously so important in the underlying part of the process, and yeah, different for different industries. But even with some of the industries you mentioned, data integrity can be a challenge. All right, so we have just a few minutes left here, but I wanted to open it up for questions in the audience, and so I think Peter's first. Oh. Yeah, we'll go to you, and then back to Peter.
Thank you for your insight. Considering that there's a lot of hesitant and trust with AI and the data that is being regulated, what exactly are the ethical bounds that are also being regulated with that? I think that brings in the hesitance. How much of our personal data is being shared with that with the AI model, but it knows not to diverge that information even though it has it. I feel like that's something that's kind of adding on to the hesitance of why people don't trust AI that much.
Yep. I'm going to leap in rudely because I'm Canadian, and we have private sector privacy legislation of general application. So we already have a model framework, or a framework that's been around for 20 plus years, and we routinely see when we're looking at service providers that they come up into Canada saying, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and we have to explain to them, thank you very much, but you can't actually do that in compliance. And so Europe, the GDPR is another example, although arguably Canada's privacy rules are actually more stringent. We're a custody and control jurisdiction, they're a processor controller jurisdiction. But we have privacy rules specifically to deal with that. So if we go back to that comment we talked about, data outcome impact is the way to look at the risk. You regulate data, you regulate outcomes, and you regulate outcomes within an impacts framework, so you're not regulating every outcome. That is a model that works, but it's one that has not necessarily evolved to all of the technologies yet. And I'll give one example, which is there's a bit of an experiment going on in British Columbia, one of our provinces on the West Coast, looking at something that they've passed called the Anti-Racism Data Act. And the Anti-Racism Data Act authorizes the provincial government and its public bodies through a controlled, open structure, start collecting racial characteristics. And so that they can begin to look at outcomes-based delivery of services to determine whether or not there is systemic racism or systemic inputs against our Human Rights Act or legislation in the delivery of those services. That is a massive change in how government will handle information, right? Because that means you need to find and measure a start state, measure a delivery of a service, measure an outcome, and see whether or not that outcome was different across a set of recipients. Normally, governments barely measure people coming in and out the door, and they kind of pray they deliver. I'm saying that deliberately to be provocative. But the idea of outcomes-based measurement that you could hold yourself accountable to is an example where AI is enabling a series of technologies to actually drive significantly, hopefully better, delivery of services, measuring things that have never been measured before.
I adore that example because I think that there's a statistical discipline called disparate impact that measures that. Is there a disparate impact on this population? And you're talking about kind of how do we regulate ethics? How do we regulate privacy? And context is hard, right? Both of those are deeply contextual values. But figuring out what we can measure, and Elham in particular was talking about that. How do we figure out how to measure bias? But realistically, AI is biased. It is discriminatory. That's what we're asking it to do. We're asking it to make a prediction. Is this a good credit risk? Should I hire this person? But then we start looking at that context and thinking about where is the disparate impact. And so we've started boiling these things down, and using disparate impact analysis is actually a really good example of a lesson learned that we can bring into the context of AI, and that people already are. But figuring out how to regulate that aspect, because if you take a piece of data about me, in some contexts, I'm really happy to have it used in AI. In other contexts, It doesn't feel like personal data at all. In other contexts, I'm going to keep that secret and not talk to anyone about it, right? And so figuring out how to deal with that kind of contextual question is and deeply personal question too, right? Like maybe my hair color is deeply personal to me, but not you. Like, I don't know. There's so much to it that requires to what Steve was talking about, figuring out what is that impact, which are the pieces of it, what are the outcomes we care about here, and figuring out how to actually regulate and measure that.
Do we have time for maybe one more? Okay. All right. Well, thank you to Stephen, Jamie, Heather for a great conversation on this topic, and many things to think about outside of just this context, but very fascinating challenges and opportunities. Opportunities come up a lot here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Hello and welcome back, everyone. If I didn't introduce myself to the previous panel, I'll just say again, I'm Chris Sands. I'm director of the Canada Institute, one of the partners here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, International Center for Scholars, co-organizing today's Canada-U.S. Legal Symposium on AI and its implications. We're about to start a tremendous panel, which I have the pleasure to introduce, a panel on disinformation, deepfakes, and the law. Our panelists for this are Olga Belagalova, who is Director of the Emerging Technologies Initiative at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, Maura Grossman, Research Professor and at the Cheriton School of Computer Science at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And then Suzanne Nossel, who is the Chief Executive Officer for PEN America and a member of the PEN Oversight Board. Or is the Oversight Board not PEN?
It's not PEN.
It's not PEN.
Yeah.
She's a member of the Oversight Board.
It's meta, yeah.
Excellent. PEN and not PEN. Thank you all for being here. And your panel moderator is the Dean of the School of Law at Case Western University, newly installed, and delightful to have you here, Dr. Paul Rose. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I'm really grateful for our expert panelists that are joining us today. This is an area that I think is of particular relevance right now at this moment in time, this next week. But of course, it's relevant all the time. It's just that it's particularly salient as we get closer to the election. I have a kind of an icebreaker question for our panelists, though, just to help set the stage a little bit. I would like our panelists to imagine that they are at a Thanksgiving dinner a couple of weeks ago in Canada, in about a month in the United States, and they have an uncle or an aunt that has questions about deepfakes and disinformation and what it means. So I guess I'd like to invite you, and we can sort of go from Olga to Mara to Suzanne, to talk for just a moment about what you see as the scope and scale of the problem. And then maybe just take a moment to talk about your work and how it intersects with those problems that we're facing now. Olga.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Chris, my colleague at SICE, for the invitation. I might flip your question and go the other way around and give you guys a sense of what I do and what makes it relevant to this particular space. In addition to running the Emerging Tech Initiative at SICE, I am a professor. I teach on disinformation and influence. I've been doing that at Johns Hopkins at SICE for a number of years, and before that at Georgetown University in the Security Studies program. And I also, prior to that, and during some of that, worked at the company formerly known as Facebook, currently known as Meta, and led the policies on countering influence operations there, including, before that, leading the threat intelligence work into Russian interference and those investigations. And so I've spent a bit of time now as a professor digging into sort of what the present day case studies are of these threats and threat actors in particular, and not just looking at Russia, but also other threat actors, including Iranian, Chinese, but also actors that target their own domestic populations in different countries around the world. And so I've sort of looked at the wide spectrum of threat actors, but also techniques that people use to engage in influence campaigns. And looking at the history as well, because so many of us have probably only started maybe thinking about or talking about some of these subjects in the last 8 years or so. But the reality is this has a very long tail in history, and there's a lot you can learn from it. In particular, we're here at the Wilson Center, and you walk past the Berlin Wall and you think about the Cold War, and Soviet active measures are a really good case study into what you can actually learn about the history of influence campaigns and the fact that we've dealt with them before. And even though there are new things, and what we're talking about here today is considered to be a new sort of era of influence operations, there are a lot of things that haven't changed. And so that's one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on is, if you look at one of the assignments I give to my students is reading testimony from the Central Intelligence Agency that was declassified to then Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1980s, where they were sort of classifying influence operations into a few different categories, covert and overt, and then things like agents of influence, paid influencers. You can trace a fairly common line from that to what we've seen in the indictments in the United States, targeting individuals that were paid by a state media organization. And so there's a lot of parallels that you can draw between case studies we see throughout history and we see today, even though there's new technology being used to run these types of campaigns. And so, what I really spend quite a bit of time talking about, and we can keep that conversation going today, is we're here to talk about AI, but there's a lot of things that are manipulated that aren't artificial intelligence, right? You can slow down a video, you can Photoshop things, and those tools have existed for a really long time. What makes it decidedly different in terms of the audience and their perception on the other end, the receiving end of the information? And the other thing is, having studied Russian threat actors and other threat actors around the world, one of the things that I know is there's a lot of perception that there's a particular goal that people who are running influence campaigns are trying to achieve, to get you to vote for someone or to not vote for someone or whatever. But most of that is bullshit. I apologize for saying that. But if you study a lot of these campaigns, the intention is to sow chaos and drive and deepen existing political division. They don't invent those divisions. They merely sort of push and prod on them, which is exactly what they did during the Cold War. And so, how much do we have to be concerned about these threats? Because there are quite a few people that are working in civil society, in government, and inside technology companies to address them. And I think we spend so much time thinking and admiring the problem on panels like these and in other places that we actually end up building and sowing further distrust in institutions as well. And so we're sort of part of the problem in a way sometimes, because we're you read the headlines from some of these really well-respected news outlets. I was just taking a look at some of them earlier today, so I'm just going to read a couple of them for you and see how they make you feel about elections and about trust in the information environment. American voters face an election disinformation crisis. Inevitable surge of election disinformation swamps voters. All of these things are, headlines from well-known institutions, MSNBC, USA Today. There's a story in New York Times just today that is sort of digging into influence campaigns, and it's saying foreign interference in American elections is becoming more sophisticated and more difficult to track. I used to do the tracking and investigations, and I know the people who do that today. And I think that kind of rhetoric and language serves the threat actors in many ways. It makes them more successful when they are internally telling their bosses about how great they did, because they do that too. And it also makes all of us think, well, you know what? I can't trust anything anymore. And that is not a very good result either. So we have to think about how we balance these things. We can't completely discount them and be complacent, but we do have to find a way to talk about these things responsibly. And as a friend of mine who works on elections in particular, Katie Harbath, she works at Duco Experts, says all the time, she's a t-shirt now, as panic responsibly. So I'm going to leave you with that.
All right, so Mara, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work and also what you see as some of the major issues or concerns as you're trying to explain this to folks.
Sure. So I'm a lawyer by training. I worked in law most of my life. The first 10 years I was a psychologist. We won't talk about that. Then I became a lawyer. Now I'm a computer scientist. And I teach at Waterloo, which is the MIT of Canada. And when I got there in 2016, I was just stunned that the only thing these students were taught was how to optimize an algorithm, how to make it faster, bigger, better, but nobody ever talked really about what are the implications of what we're building and who gets harmed and who gets helped and all that kind of stuff. So I've introduced those kinds of courses at Waterloo, and I also teach at Osgoode Hall Law School, and I teach the tech to the lawyers, because you cannot make rules and regulations if you have no idea how the tech works. So I've been working in responsible AI for 5-6 years now, and I started to get a little obsessed. I'm actually a little more worried about this stuff than you, but I'm going to take it into a different context. In the old days, if I wanted to defraud somebody and I was going to fake their signature on a check, I actually had to have some talent. You know, it actually needs to look like the person's signature. Today, I can go on the internet. All I need is a computer and an internet access, and I can take 15 seconds of your voice. I would have more than enough, and I could make something that sounds exactly like you. And I can go into a court and present that, or I can do a lot of really dangerous things with that. And unless you have some expertise, because right now the technology is not great at distinguishing, it's not reliable enough, somebody can't tell. So the issue is somebody goes into court, and it's a family court, and they go in ex parte, meaning they go in alone, they don't invite the other side in, and they say, I want a protective order. My husband's threatening to kill me and the kids. He's going to lock us in the trunk of the car and drive it into the lake, and I have him on the phone, and I want to play you my phone, Judge, and I want a protective order. I want the kids taken away from him immediately, given to me full custody. What is that judge supposed to do? How on earth is that judge supposed to know whether that is a real voice or not? So, of course, they make this decision of taking the kids away because it's the more conservative decision, but that has implications for the person, too, in terms of their custody rights, in terms of all kinds of things. So I'm a little obsessed with this. I'm worried about the justice system, and I'm less worried about what you're talking about, but I'm very worried about the justice system, which relies a lot on people being able to discern evidence with their eyes and ears and make a decision about who's telling the truth. And that is becoming, I think, harder and harder and harder.
Thank you. Suzanne.
Thanks for having me. You know, it's funny, when you started in about the uncle, I thought you were going to talk about sort of the classic story, the uncle who has bought into all the conspiracy theories, and what do you say at Thanksgiving? And that's actually something, we have this tip sheet that we've done at Penn America, how to talk to your friends and family about disinformation, because one of the most, very few kind of viable interlocutors is somebody that you know well, is a family member or a trusted friend, in terms of who can sometimes sort of pierce through and help someone see that what they're taking in is a falsehood. But just to talk a bit about our work, so we're a free expression organization, and when after the 2016 election, when disinformation, fake news sort of first became the watchword, we analyzed it, I think, kind of for the first time as a free expression threat, in the sense that if you look at why it is that we protect free expression, it's not just so that you can shout at the top of your lungs, it's so that we can have an open discourse, we can persuade one another, we can find the truth, we can catalyze scientific innovation and creativity. And all of that is undercut in a world that's flooded with disinformation, where no one knows what to believe. And so we came to be concerned that if disinformation was to spread untrammeled, that kind of our whole discourse would be dragged down. And the sad part, I mean, one of the things we talked about back then was, something like, we were just speculating about kind of where this could go, what could happen. We talked about pandemic response, and that pandemic response could really be undercut if people didn't know what to believe. And so, of course, we've now witnessed a lot of that conjecture kind of coming true. And so, then the question becomes, well, what do you do about it? And in 2020, we experimented in a number of interesting ways. We developed a disinformation training, and it was the pandemic, and so we could do it at a pretty substantial scale, at least for us as a small organization, training people to discern, to ferret out more trustworthy sources of information, to look at kind of the indicia of trustworthiness in their feed, to understand what different information sources were all about and what the origins were. And it was successful, but we also kind of despaired of getting to any sort of scale. It just, and we had more scale then because everybody was on Zoom, and it didn't require kind of bringing people into a room. And so then another thing we did during that election cycle was hone in on the role of journalists and the media. And we did a whole series of things, but the thing that, I think was the most meaningful was we pulled together the heads of the different decision desks from the AP and I think ABC and Fox News to have a discussion, kind of decision desk leader to decision desk leader. How were they going to deal with the mail-in ballots and the fact that, we all knew the election probably wasn't going to be called on election night, which, was a very, now I think we're kind of used to that, but that was still a very rare thing. And, just how central their calls were going to be to shaping an election where we knew there was going to be a claim that it was invalid, and that there's already a lot of groundwork that had been laid for calling into question the results of the election. And so that was a great event, and I still feel like the call that Fox News made on election night for Arizona, really sort of set in motion. I mean, a lot of what would ensue, and I think we would have been in a very different situation in 2020 had they not made that call that night. But what we realized in the course of that work was that journalists did not seem to have the tools they needed to deal with disinformation in the course of their work. And we did a survey where we substantiated that. We had like 4 out of 5 the journalists that we surveyed say, no, I'm not getting the support, the training, the tools and resources that I need from my newsroom to contend with what they all, in very large numbers said was kind of had become a daily issue in the work that they were doing. And so in this cycle, we've done 2 major things. One is a big outreach program where we've developed a set of resources for journalists to help them approach both how to report on disinformation, how to identify and deal with disinformation that they encounter in the course of reporting on other topics, how to contend with disinformation directed at discrediting them. And we've done now trainings with over 3,000 journalists in I think about 50 newsrooms across the country, large and small. And that's been fascinating, and I feel like it is a good way to achieve some degree of scale, because each of, it's hundreds of millions of, in terms of audience for all of those newsrooms. So if they can do a better job avoiding becoming a vector for disinformation and also helping the public to understand what they're seeing, I think that's, a useful thing. The other piece we're doing now is some work in kind of 3 different communities to educate and train trusted messengers. So individuals with some stature in the community, some of them are pastors and people involved in the religious world, small business owners, teachers, librarians, for them to be engaged, going back to where I began, that usually it's kind of somebody that you know and respect is the most effective in trying to draw your attention to disinformation and kind of pull you back to reality. So we've been doing this work to empower those people.
Thank you. So I have individual questions for each of our panelists, but of course, I invite you to comment on the responses if you're so inclined. So let me go back to Olga to start with. So you direct the Emerging Technologies Initiative. So could you discuss how public policy and the technology sector might better collaborate? So let's say, legislators or regulators and the technology sector to address disinformation, particularly with regard to emerging technologies like AI-driven content generation.
So there is a lot of work that's already been done in this space. And in particular, we talked about this 2016 being kind of the moment for a lot of this work starting both in the United States and in other countries. And you can see the creation of different agencies and organizations within governments around the world. So you can see things like the Hybrid Center of Excellence in Finland. You can see the Foreign Aligned Influence Center here in the United States, the Foreign Influence Task Force, a lot of different organizations that are stood up to specifically address these threats. And then and then members of Congress and others that are dealing with these issues specifically, whether it's just AI or the disinformation threat. And there has been an establishment of a relationship that exists with the people that are, on the AI front, to the people that are building the technologies and then the technology platforms that are being used for dissemination of content. And one of the things that I think it's important to note, particularly since we're here in Washington, D.C., is that there has been a strain on that relationship, in part because of how politicized all of this has become. And that strain has affected the governments, the technology companies, and the civil society researchers, some of whom have been targeted in lawsuits and brought in before the Weaponization Committee in Congress because people are sort of trying to add, this is the problem with the space because it involves political speech. In some cases, people sort of can add some conspiracy theories to, I personally have been excused of being a member of, the deep state because I have government work experience and then I went to go work at a technology platform to address these issues. But, it's very easy to invent these stories when the reality is these relationships are really important. And most of the time what's happening behind those closed doors are people are exchanging intelligence that they've been able to gain using either their data or other intelligence collection methods to say, I'm seeing this, are you seeing this, exchanging ideas, and then being able to, at no point in time and this is the sort of accusation, have governments, come out and said, like, you need to take this down. It's, hey, I've seen this particular threat actor, have you seen it? And that conversation needs to be happening. Now, it's a question of, when that's happening, with non-authoritarian nation states. But there are a lot of authoritarian governments that have, also stepped into this space and have created, and even not necessarily authoritarian governments, but others that have created laws that are like, if you don't take down whatever we call a bot within 7 hours, we're going to fine you. And that's also a problem because that means that, that does, potentially infringe on people's speech. And, I've seen some very, liberal-minded governments around the world coming in and saying whatever we say is disinformation is going to be disinformation. And you can imagine how that might be abused if a particular political party is in power and wants to target its opposition. So you have to be mindful about how, people always talk about technology platforms being powerful, and I spent a lot of time, having those conversations as a representative of a technology platform. But governments are quite powerful too. There are governments that have arrested employees of tech companies or, thrown them in jail because they didn't like their content moderation decisions, and that's scary as well. And so you have to think about sort of what the appropriate balance is and who the bodies are that are going to be doing this work. Now, you asked specifically about the sort of AI piece of this. And I think when it comes to the nexus of AI and disinformation, you have to think about what you're actually trying to address. Now, if your uncle, for example, is talking to an artificial intelligence tool and trying to create some, ask it a question and learn something about an elections process or whatever, that's one area where you might need to think about, okay, well, what kind of information is being provided, what kind of information is not being provided. But let's say that person shares information with their friends and family. They're misinformed. Like, they don't know any better, right? They are not, that's why it's important to make a distinction between disinformation and misinformation, because, that person doesn't know any better. So how do you educate them? What kind of, sort of literacy work can be done to make sure that that person isn't making that mistake in the future, that they can find the verification tools that they need, which is distinct from, some foreign threat actor or even domestic threat actor, creating a set of fake accounts and deliberately running a troll farm to try to deceive people about who they are and what they're doing. Those are very decidedly different problems, and you have to deal with them from a legal and regulatory perspective in a different way, because you don't want to be punishing your uncle for not knowing any better, right? So you have to be mindful about that.
Thank you. So I want to go back to something that Mara was talking about in her opening remarks, and that is the challenges that deepfakes and disinformation pose to the justice system. So you mentioned, for example, a judge just trying to figure out what to do with information they don't know whether it's fake or not fake. So could you expand on that a little bit? I mean, how have courts thought about that? Are there any tools in place that can help triers of fact to discern a deep fake from truthful information?
Well, certainly, if everybody can afford to bring in an expert in every matter, and we had the time for that, then everybody would bring in a forensic expert, and probably we could sort this stuff out. But like 80% of the cases in the United States, people aren't even represented by an attorney, no less being able to afford an expert. But let me tell you this. So this experiment has been done. A bunch of you play a game of cards. Everything goes fine, no problem, nothing untoward. After the game of cards, half of you are brought into one room and half of you are brought into another room. In the first room, the person says, Suzanne cheated. We saw her cheat. Did anybody see her cheat? And is anybody prepared to sign an affidavit saying she cheated? It was, no, we didn't see Suzanne cheat. Of course she didn't cheat. I'm not going to sign an affidavit. And the other room, they show a deep fake that shows Suzanne cheating. And then they say, how many of you saw Suzanne cheat and are prepared to sign an affidavit swearing you saw her cheat? And half the people raised their hands. So this audio-video stuff has a way of altering our perception, altering our memory, and sort of playing around with what we see as truth. And maybe experts can deal with this, but the average person can't. So what happens is they either become so cynical that they don't even try anymore. And we saw that with some of the Hurricane Helene stuff, where people just, who normally would give money, but they see the little girl clutching the puppy and everything, and then they find out that's fake, and then they say it's all scams, I'm not going to give anybody a penny. So they either become completely cynical and disengaged, or else you have the opposite, which is called the liar's dividend, which is anybody can say, deep fake, deep fake, deep fake, I didn't say that, it's not real. And then reality gets confused with what's fake. And I don't think the court system, I'm not talking about governments or anybody else, I don't think the court system, either in the US or Canada, really has the tools to deal with that problem yet. They don't have, because rules to admit evidence are very, very, very low standard. So if I want to get Suzanne's voice in, if I have her on a recording, all I have to do is bring somebody in who knows her, who's heard her, and I play the recording and say, does that sound like Suzanne to you? And the person says, yes, I've talked to Suzanne a million times, that's definitely Suzanne. And it comes in. And then it's up to the jury to figure out what to do with that, how much weight to give it. But they believe it because you're sitting there saying it's not me in the exact same voice that you just heard say it. So that's the issue, is that I don't think the courts have the education, and I don't think the courts have the time, and I don't think they have the tools to deal with this stuff that's, we've always had the problem of fakes. What we haven't always had, the problem is that anybody with a computer and an internet connection can now, we've democratized fraud. So anybody can do it, and unless you have somebody with some degree of expertise, people play this game with me all the time, real or fake, and I get 80% wrong. They're good these days. Unless it has 6 fingers or something. And then I saw an ad the other day. You can now buy a fake finger so that you can wear a fake finger in a photo, so that if somebody takes a picture, you have plausible deniability that isn't a real picture because it's got 6 fingers in it. Who would think of that? Who would think of that, right?
So as a quick follow-up to that, though, I guess I would invite you to help us think through a response that I'm going to give you, which is that someone might say, well, why don't we just heighten the standards of evidence, just make it more difficult to introduce evidence? Is that a solution? How would that work?
Well, I visited the U.S. Evidence Rules Committee 3 or 4 times. I've been spectacularly unsuccessful at convincing them about doing anything yet. It takes 3 to 5 years to put rules in place. The technology may be extraordinarily different 3 to 5 years from now. That they won't make that kind of change because they don't change rules for technology. What we've said is increase the gatekeeping role of the judge and allow the judge to keep some of this stuff out if there is at least some modicum of evidence that it may be fake. And even that they have not bought yet. So they're considering again in their November rule, Judge Paul Grimm and I have made another proposal. But we need to give them the tools. But I don't think they would do something as drastic as changing the standard.
So, Suzanne, you talked a little bit about the work of PEN America at the beginning and how you advocate for free expression. But I guess I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about how PEN approaches that balance between protecting free expression and addressing disinformation, particularly when it comes to media companies and tech platforms. And I guess this is something that we had talked about in our conversation before meeting today, where I guess I'm personally wonder about an argument that might be made where someone could say, well, yes, that is fake, but it gets at a truth.
Yeah.
Not the truth, but a truth. It gets at some larger truth, and so even if that was a deep fake or it's something like that, it should be protected because it still gets at some truth, so it's not disinformation. So I guess I'd like to hear how your organization thinks about free expression and disinformation, and then specifically that question of helping us figure out freedom of expression in areas where you can test what is truth.
Yeah. So, when we first began working in this area, a conclusion that we drew pretty quickly was that as a free expression organization, we really could not get involved in trying to kind of stop the supply side of disinformation because of the First Amendment and other global free expression protections, because it really is virtually impossible to kind of draw a bright line around disinformation, or a defensible line. As someone, I think Olga mentioned, the risk of that being politicized. And we saw that from the beginning in terms of claims of fake news. And the claim of fake news was about real news. It was about the major kind of mainstream serious journalism outlets were all being characterized as purveyors of fake news. And so from the beginning, it was clear that this was going to be a sharply disputed concept. And we've only seen that more and more. And we've had, one of the most kind of contentious episodes that I think has been highly consequential is the Hunter Biden laptop, where it kind of had all the earmarks, or people felt it had all the earmarks of a kind of active measure of foreign interference that surfacing just days before the election, and yet, and so the social media companies throttled it back, and certain media outlets didn't report on it, and then it turned out, well, it actually was his laptop, and so then that became, I think, a predicate for a lot of aggressive efforts to both go after disinformation researchers and kind of politicize the field and call into question whether there's any legitimacy or this is just a political agenda. The pieces of legislation that we've seen, now rejected by the Supreme Court, but to sharply curtail the platform's ability to moderate content in Florida and in Texas. And so, that kind of boundary line in terms of the supply is I think, pretty infinitely contested. And so we sort of focused more on the demand side. How do you equip people to grapple with this in the course of their day-to-day lives? How do you equip journalists to deal with it in the course of their work and avoid amplifying and propagating it? And so, I think that's, for a free expression organization, the right answer, but what it doesn't address or resolve is sort of these really difficult line drawing questions, and that's some of what we get into in the oversight board, where we're looking at complicated content moderation decisions for meta platforms, and what is the boundary between disinformation and satire or political speech? And our body is global, so if someone's making a characterization of the Ayatollah, and it's hyperbolic and they're comparing them to an animal, or is that disinformation? Is that political speech? Is that satirical? And where do you draw the lines? And we, as a body, we are committed to upholding international human rights standards, which are very protective of free expression. And so, most of the time we decide in favor of kind of allowing the content on the platform rather than trying to take it down. But, the line drawing questions are really difficult. Can you discern some intent to actually deceive? And it goes to the question you're raising about, so-called disinformation that may get at an underlying truth. And of course, that's something we've had throughout our culture. We're a literary organization. Literature is, it's about fiction gets at underlying truths. That's why we love it and why it's important. Satire is, does the same. It sort of, it points out something, makes an argument or a point by, through an illustration or, in another way that kind of distorts and bends reality. And, we want to allow that in our discourse. Like, we can't get rid of that. And then, yet you see something like Springfield, Ohio, and, sort of a falsehood that is provably false, but that, does plug into other fears and perhaps other phenomenon, and that, the justification that's being used that, it gets at a larger truth. And, that seems, I think, to a lot of people sort of clearly over the line. But how you would even articulate that boundary line becomes really, really difficult. And also, who adjudicates? It can be a platform if it's on one platform, but very often these things boomerang, all throughout different arenas. And so, ultimately, I think you want people to be discerning. It's hard to achieve that, though, without running into the problem Olga cites, which is if people are constantly cognizant of the risk of disinformation, does that just accelerate the undercutting of trust in institutions and the like? So, that's why I think these issues are so thorny.
Paul, can I make one comment on that?
Please.
So, I don't know about you folks, but when I was a kid, you watched the news and there was the news. There wasn't blue news and red news or left news and right news or whatever you want to call them now. There was the news because most of us could agree on facts. I'm not sure we live in that world anymore today. And even Photoshop has helped with that, because say I take a picture of you and you aren't smiling, but I want to do a more attractive smile. So I Photoshop it and take your smile from another picture and I put it in. But that's not real, because you weren't smiling in this picture, but you have smiled at some point in life, so it is real. And so is that picture real, or is that picture not real? I mean, what is an okay amount? You know, or when Princess Kate did whatever she did to the picture, was that an acceptable amount of manipulation? So we don't have a black and white world anymore where there's the news. There are multiple versions of things where we can argue about which one is the truth.
I would argue that we've always had that. And I think, you know, I didn't, you know, I was born in the Soviet Union, so I didn't have that sort of, you know, this is the truth and not, because a lot of what, you know, the Soviet government did during that time was the news wasn't the news, right? And there's a joke about how, you know, you can't, the only time you can find Pravda in the publication Pravda is in its title, right? For those of you that speak Russian, that don't speak Russian, that means the truth. And there's a publication called Pravda in the Soviet Union. And so, you know, not all of us have always lived in that world where, you know, the news was the news. And so I think for a long time around the world, there's always been, you know, a lot of, you know, manipulation, distrust, and other things. And my course when I used to teach it at Georgetown was called Lies, Damn Lies, and Disinformation. And one of the reasons for that is because people have been lying for a really long time. And, you know, and people lie in marketing. You know, I think you both have talked about a couple different situations, you know, satire and other fields where people lie for fun. You know, some people want to tell you that you can charge your phone using an onion, right? That was a funny thing on the internet. But then, you know, when that turns into like people eating Tide Pods, no one's like, you know, there's no like malicious person going around being like, you know, I'm just going to kill a whole bunch of people because I'm going to make them eat Tide Pods. There's just someone who thinks it would be funny to watch the world burn, and so they do that for fun, right? And so, you know, there are people, you know, you think all the way back to like when the printing press was, you know, first created, you know, there was this concern that there was a loss of control, that the church had lost control over information, because all of a sudden someone like Martin Luther could go publish some information that was, you know, unfavorable to the church. And, you know, there was a French king that wanted to, you know, sentence people to death for even using the printing press. And so, you know, every sort of iteration of technological development has led to more the democratization of information and people's ability to create anything with new technology. And we have had to, throughout time, grapple with those changes. And that's not to say, you know, I know that I sound generally more confident than my co-panelists, but I think there's a reason why I study this subject, right? I care about it. I think it's important and have dedicated a good portion of my career to it because it does matter. But it also, you know, we have to realize that we have actually as a society dealt with various iterations of this before, and I'm confident that we can do it again. We're just kind of in the middle of it right now, and I think we can get there.
Well, I have one more question, but I'm going to save it in case you don't have any questions. I want to give you time to ask questions of our panelists. Please, in the back, sir, first. We have the two gentlemen right there in a row. Yeah.
I'll just speak loud. You've got a mic right next to you.
Oh, okay, great. Olga, just picking up on your last point. By the way, fantastic panel. Really, really great discussion, and grateful to be here. But the question I have comes back, Olga, to the point of what are our adversaries or not friendlies doing? We're having these discussions, and we're trying to, as you say, get from the middle to a point where we can be in a better place, and we can have regulators and guidelines and rules. But I don't get the sense that this is happening in Russia or China or other parts of the world where they don't care. And it's a bit, and I wouldn't draw too fine a point on it, but it's a bit like climate, right? We're all concerned about rising greenhouse gas emissions. They're not. They're building, you know, more coal-fired generation. So what if we get really good at curtailing this and making sure it's being used for an ethical purpose. I don't have any confidence that this is happening or that there's even a discussion about it. So I mean, that's a big open-ended question, but how do we contend with that reality, if it is a reality, if it's not a deep fake?
Well, it's a big question, but I think, the internet has, for better or for worse, globalized the information environment. And, if we're talking about what some of them are doing, some of them are trying to close off the internet, right? Authoritarian countries are trying to sort of create this line around where their internet ends and begins, where is it, RUNET or the Chinese internet? Or also, you see authoritarian countries periodically turning off the internet or shutting down social media platforms. Russia, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, did shut down a number of social media companies inside their country. People still use VPNs to get around that, to access some of these things. Sorry? Iran is that involved. Yes, exactly. But because we are still at the moment in a relatively globalized information environment, whether they do anything or not, we're going to still deal with whatever is created in different countries around the world. And so that's why these laws, need to apply to whatever we happen to encounter. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. I think that's one of the misconceptions I often see is people tend to, because they don't want to politicize this, focus on the foreign interference part of this. But increasingly, my old team, when I worked at Meta, we found more and more domestic troll farms in countries targeting their own domestic populations, right? So that's what they're doing, right? We found troll farms in Azerbaijan, Nicaragua, in the Philippines, right? And some of these places. And those, can later, whatever content is being created there can be seen by anyone, right? And so you have to be mindful, the ways that we create those guardrails, we can't necessarily wait for someone else to catch up. Unfortunately, that means, the people that live in those societies are, limited in their freedom of expression and, their voices are suppressed. And, the Russian threat actors that I have studied, and particularly the Internet Research Agency, prior to anyone paying attention to it in 2016, largely focused on targeting its own domestic audiences in Russia, focused on divisive issues within Russia. And you see that a lot in a few of these different places.
Question here and then over here.
Yeah, my question is almost the same as the one that was just asked, but it had a slightly different twist, so I'll go ahead and ask it anyway. In the first several generations of information technology, the focus, legal focus, technology focus, commercial focus, was so much in the United States that it wasn't difficult for the United States to develop standards and laws and then sort of migrate them into Europe and other allied countries through the Five Eyes and other mechanisms, and then eventually to the rest of the world, which didn't know what was going on. So I guess that's what we do. And this was clearly the case with the regulation of the internet in the 1990s, and then it's what we're facing today is a significantly different political situation in which there is in my judgment, a growing suspicion, backlash, resistance to that model, pushed no doubt by Russia and China and other countries, but the concept that American solutions will be adopted in Canada and England and Australia and New Zealand and then the rest of the world is being actively resisted at the UN and in other international fora dealing with the emergence of all of the subjects, deep fakes, artificial intelligence, and all that. Given that, as the panel has said, this is clearly a global technology which ignores borders, and you can't really have a standard, you can't really have a rule, you can't really have a law if it doesn't apply widely. What is the pathway forward in reaching international consensus, agreement, or anything?
So I'll take a stab at that. It's really interesting because you're correct in many areas. U.S. and Canada took the lead in the regulation, but in the AI, the U.S. has absolutely not, and the EU has actually been out in the forefront, maybe with Canada a little behind, but the U.S. way behind. So that's a big difference in this particular sphere. I think what concerns people, there's the commercial concerns, but there's the autonomous weapons concerns, and nobody wants somebody else to get ahead of them in building those and find themselves, on the back of somebody's thumb or something like that. That's a real problem because you're not going to have global regulations. You may get certain countries to agree, but you're not going to get everybody to agree. And if you don't get everybody to agree on autonomous weapons, for example, lethal autonomous weapons, then everybody has to develop them because nobody wants to be left without having them.
The one thing I'd add that I think is interesting, there's this, I don't know who coined the expression, but it's Europe regulates, America innovates. When it comes to the AI piece, right, the technology is primarily being built in the United States. Most of the technology companies that are developing breakthroughs in AI are largely being built in the United States. But in Europe is where the regulation is happening, and it's not because someone doesn't like the idea of America leading in regulation. It's because Europe has been more proactive in the regulation space. That's not to say, I will say, what I've seen from European regulation doesn't always mean that it aligns with values that the United States has about freedom of expression and other things like that. So sometimes, there might be a bit of a disagreement between the way the Europeans are wanting to do this, and there's a question of does the United States and Canada want Europe to be leading in this regulation space, because it might create standards that we may not be interested in adhering to.
Right, and there's also, just to add, why is it that they're so much further ahead? It's, a big part is our own dysfunction, and the fact that we haven't, we've gotten very little legislation on anything through the most recent Congresses, and how does that relate to the problems that we're talking about that shape our political climate? And just to come back to something that Olga said about her upbringing in the Soviet Union, and the idea that, well, we never, that sort of what you're positing, Maura, is this world where there was the truth on the news, and everyone believed it, and that that in many places that never existed. It was probably illusory even here, but it's also true that in Russia, 85% of people vote for Putin, and that's the political culture that you have, and so I think it's not like that worked out fine, So I think that's what we have to be very thoughtful about. I think it's impossible to parse exactly cause and effect between what's happened in our information ecosystem and what's happened in our politics, but I think it's virtually everybody's intuition that there is a strong connection and uncertainty about kind of how to unwind that.
I think we had one last question. Time for one last question right here, I think.
Thank you. This is great. And my Wilson Center colleagues will have to take 2 drinks because I'm going to mention both radio and the Polish Solidarity Movement. But Olga, you talked about the printing press, and I think also about radio is another moment where fraud has been democratized, right? So we've been here before, as you mentioned, and we got through it somehow. And I wonder, when you look particularly in the early 40s, there was an interesting investment made in art and the arts and humanities more broadly, and performance, and thinking about how we communicate information. So I'm curious, aside from media literacy, what you think the role for how we talk about whatever it is we're talking about, particularly national security, where that comes in, and doing our very own influence campaigns.
Well, that last part that you just mentioned, I think that there might be some, different views on this, but, I'm a big believer that I don't think it's beneficial for liberal democracies to engage in offensive influence operations. I don't think that it's valuable, and when you've seen them uncovered, you've actually, it creates just more ammo for people to, use it for whataboutism and to claim that, these countries are doing all the same things. That said, it doesn't have to be an influence operation. And I think, Suzanne was talking about the supply side and the demand side, but I think there's almost another piece, which is, maybe changing what the supply entails and adding, some effective strategic communication to it is part of, I spent a lot of years playing whack-a-mole, dealing with the supply side of things. And you can do that forever, take down troll farms, find networks of fake accounts, identify foreign interference campaigns. And that was very valuable work. And we know a lot about these tactics. But if we are not adding anything to the information environment and, someone else is flooding the zone, whether it's a domestic or foreign actor, then, we need to be sort of smart about, you can look back through the history of the 1940s. In particular, you mentioned radio. There's a really good book I'd recommend for those that are interested in that time period, and this, which is Peter Pomerantsev's most recent book about how to win an information war. And he talks about the way in which the Brits countered Nazi propaganda, which was largely on the radio. Now, they did engage in some offensive influence operations and deception, manipulation, targeting people in Germany, but being effective strategic communicators is also an important part of this, telling a story a little bit more effectively. And I'll just quickly share an anecdote, which I share with my students all the time, which is I think a really effective and important thing that happened at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was that the U.S. government decided to declassify knowledge of a video that was going to be shared to be used as a precursor for the invasion. And that's something that they gathered intelligence about and then very quickly were able to declassify and share that. And that was very important that the U.S. government did that. But if you watch the press conference where Ned Price is talking to the reporters and sharing information about this, he gets a lot of questions from the reporters in the room. And they're saying, well, why should we trust you? And, you're just telling us this. Like, why should we know it's true? And that's a skeptical but informed audience, right? But part of the reason for that is because they have sort of trauma from Vietnam, from Iraq, and from other periods of time where they don't trust the institutions that are sharing that information. And so part of, the effective strategic communication is rebuilding the trust in those institutions, sharing more information more effectively. And you're seeing, for example, the Foreign Malign Influence Center ahead of this election in the United States has been doing an incredible job of regularly sharing updates ahead of the election about what they're seeing and what they're not seeing happen. So you're seeing a lot of movement from certain governments trying to get better at this and rebuilding that trust.
Yeah, and just, to add, one thing during the pandemic that the platforms did and meta platforms did was that they elevated trusted information. We have the CDC and the WHO, in matters where there was still kind of some degree of consensus about, whether the vaccine worked or whether masks, obviously the consensus evolved on various topics, including masking. But, one of the challenges is it feels like there's a dwindling set of topics where such a consensus exists, and would it exist on the next pandemic? Because it was fragile. What was the origin story of the pandemic? What worked to safeguard people? And so I agree that kind of affirmative messaging and elevating credible information is part of the puzzle, but that's not, that too is becoming more difficult.
Well, and with AI, there's so much information and such an ability to produce, billions of messages that I worry that it'll just all there'll be so much of it that it'll become harder and harder.
Well, eventually it'll just be like AI talking to AI. And
we'll
sit back and
we'll just go to the beach.
Well, this has been an excellent discussion, excellent panel. Please join me in thanking our experts.
It's interesting learning about your work.
After that fantastic panel, we're going to change the scenes to our next panel. This time looking at regulatory frameworks on a spectrum from subnational to national to multinational. And we have a terrific group to present on this particular issue. I'm going to take a pause before I introduce our panel while we're changing the scene. to give a shout out to the Honorable Peter MacKay, who's here. We had a shout out earlier to Jim Blanchard. Former Governor Blanchard is one of the co-chairs of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, and the newest co-chair of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute is Peter MacKay. Some of you will know him as Defense Minister, Foreign Minister, Justice Minister, Justice of the Peace, Minister of all things. He's a great Canadian public policy leader, and you heard him in a question just in the last session, so just another example of his leadership. Peter, welcome. Glad you're here. So this panel, I will invite the panelists and everyone to come up. This is a panel which will be moderated by my colleague here at the Wilson Center, Xavier Delgado, Zabi, as we like to call him, or he lets us call him. But we also have an all-star cast for the panel itself. We have our colleague, I guess Zabi and my colleague, Kelly Wicker, who's the director of our Science, Technology, and Innovation program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Kate Purchase, good friend and senior director of international AI governance for Microsoft. And Marc-Etienne Ouimet, who is the global lead for AI policy for Amazon Web Services. And with that, let me hand it over to you, Zabi.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. Hello to everyone in the room. Hello to everybody back home. We have the unique challenge of having one of the most broad topics while also being the last panel of the day. But to help with that, we've assembled here what somebody described when I told them who was on this panel as the Avengers of AI policy. Kelly Wicker, Kate Purchase, Marc-Etienne Ouimet. We're going to talk for a little bit through some moderated discussion, then we want to throw it out to the audience to get to all of your questions before we wrap up for the day. Kelly, maybe we can start with you and just a reaction to everything that we've been hearing, especially at that last panel. We got a little bit about the regulatory and governance frameworks that are emerging in the United States. Can you give us your lay of the land and set the scene for us? What's your take on the state of governance here in America?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So we have a lot of things going on, and Ilham kind of laid this out for us really nicely this morning, but we're seeing two tracks, essentially, the things that are happening in the states and the things that are happening at the federal level. And I will push back a little bit on what one of the panelists said before, not to deny that we have dysfunction in our Congress at the moment, but I will deny that the dysfunction is the reason we don't have overarching AI regulation. There has been a relatively purposeful push in Congress to legislate on narrow uses, narrow problems, narrow issues, in a way that lets us be highly effective without putting in some kind of massive, clumsy, immediately outdated legislative mechanism that we will have to then push against for the rest of our lives. I know a lot of people saw the passage of the AI Act in the EU as a win, and it was in many ways for them. A lot of the things that they were able to put in place are things that we need here. But in general, a lot of what they did was use proxies for things that are very hard. Ilham talked a lot about measurement. It's very hard to measure these things. It's very hard to define them. And if you pass a bill without having defined and measured them, it means that that thing is very difficult to work with and work around. So what we're doing here is the executive order kind of functions as our overarching federal framework. The executive order that we saw put in place last October essentially went to every agency and said, you're in charge of this. Where AI touches labor, you're in charge of that. Where AI touches housing, you're in charge of that. This is no different. As people have been talking about all day, AI is a tool, not a world-breaking technology. It has many things it does that are new, but many of the things that it does is just a new form of a very old problem. You're in charge of this, handle it. And there's a lot of things that the agencies do need Congress to give them permission to do, but there's much that they can do without waiting. I'm sure we'll eventually see some kind of bill that will tackle some things about, definitions of risks and capabilities and things like that. But for now, I would not call it a failure on part of Congress to put in some kind of large bill that I think is intentional, and I think that's the right call. Let's not do something we're going to regret. And then have to deal with the business and social consequences of that. At the state level, you're kind of seeing a similar thing play out. Many states, I think over 25 now, have something on the books on deepfakes because it's personal, it's understandable, it's narrow, you can do something about this. We know what to do. It may just be civil, it may be criminal, who knows, but there is something in place that says this is what you can do about these things. Where the states have tried to tackle something larger, like the Senate bill we saw fail in California recently, kind of the same thing as what we were talking about with the federal. A lot of people's real big issue with that bill was that it created moats for smaller companies. There was disagreement as to whether that was true, but there was fear that the large companies would use that as a way to keep smaller companies out. And then there were also a lot of fears that the way we were defining high risk did not actually reflect which models are high risk. And until we can properly define it, why would we legislate it? And I think that's why we ultimately saw that bill fail. We're still seeing a lot of state-level strategies, state-level pushes to implement, some focus on opportunity here as well. How can we empower ourselves to use it? How can we prepare? How can we implement? But I think those two things, the state level is happening in the absent of federal policy, but they very much harmonize, I think, which sometimes gets lost with our messaging around that Congress is broken, the government is broken, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks, Kelly. Our two esteemed panelists at the end here work on global AI policy, but they're also Canadian. So perhaps Mark and then Kate will do that order. Mark, can you just react to what Kelly said and perhaps bring in a Canadian and international context here when we look at AI governance?
Sure. Well, one, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there is definitely within Canada and within Canadian government circles a perspective that there is kind of one show in town with regards to AI regulation, and that's the EU AI Act and the EU's approach, and that what we're not seeing emanate out of the US at the federal level is due to, as Kelly was pointing out, and as prior panelists pointed out, a perception of kind of congressional dysfunction as opposed to a very kind of concerted, I think, bipartisan approach to not wanting to have a horizontal central piece of legislation. And I think that's problematic, frankly, within Canada, because as opposed to kind of wrestling with the pros and cons of each regulatory approach, it is just perceived as if like we need to act and we have the ability to act, therefore this is the way that you do so. I essentially follow the European model. We think that is a problematic approach to take for a few reasons. One, the centralized approach, even if you think that's the right teleological end, it's the right method to leverage, necessarily requires to have definitions of high impact use cases or high risk use cases. In Canada, they call them high impact, centralized within one regulatory function. And we think that's essentially like a Sisyphean task. Like if you thought about the central body that would be responsible for every single AI application, electrical application that there is, from nuclear power plants to the types of plugs you should have in your kitchen, and having one central body responsible for that, I don't think that's reflective of how kind of we've evolved to essentially have a building code and have codes for nuclear power plants and everything else that comes with it. So a decentralized approach also instrumentally will tend to work better because you are capable of leveraging the existing powers of the departments that you have within your jurisdiction. So we're talking about asking the Department of Transport to regulate its use cases. Same goes within Canada. If there's a central bill like the bill that's proposed, and ICED is responsible for every single application of artificial intelligence and its regulation and its definition as high risk or not, you're not taking advantage of the institutional capacity of all of the other departments who are capable of doing that assessment in a far more, we'd argue, precise way. And it's important for Canada to kind of wrestle with that precision, because I think, as most people know who are familiar with the Canadian political and economic landscape, there are important productivity issues in Canada. There's important growth and GDP issues in Canada. If you unduly capture what are really low-risk AI applications by having too broad of a definition of a high-risk AI category, then you're putting barriers in place that are really unnecessary to improve the productivity of your firms across the country. And just I saw yesterday that you had, I think it was Tiff Macklem was mentioning, like, we need to be really, really proactive at making sure we're not getting own goals here. And I think that could be part of the process or part of the issue.
Thanks, Mark. Kate, you not only work on governance, but you actually came from government. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on all that's been said so far, perhaps picking up where Mark left off.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think as a recovering political strategist, I like to sort of think about things in threes, in the way that all good political speeches do. And so I think, a lot of what Mark was talking about in terms of how we think about the regulatory architecture and the need for it to match the technology architecture. So we've talked a lot today about the application layer. We actually haven't talked a lot today about the infrastructure layer. Those are the data centers that we're building out around the world. And then the model layer of like talking about the LLMs and all of the ones that, we sort of have now in common parlance. And when we talk about that big horizontal regulation, we're not really thinking about it in the same way as the technology architecture exists, and I think that's problematic. And one of the reasons that we focus quite a lot, frankly, at the global governance level, in addition to that national level, in addition to that subnational level, is really because we see different roles for each of that regulatory architecture as it relates to the technology architecture. And so to give a couple of examples for you, one is just thinking about that, picking up a little bit about the productivity and growth concerns in Canada. I knew the Canada really came out there. I apologize for my accent, my God. We did a study a couple of months ago that with Accenture that said there would be $100 billion of economic value in SMEs in Canada by 2030 if they adopted AI. That's, incredible, and would be a huge growth accelerator for the Canadian economy. They will not achieve that kind of adoption if they are hiring, with all due respect to the folks in this room and online, a bunch of lawyers. They will achieve that adoption if they are hiring more engineers, if they're thinking about how to use those data sets appropriately, if they're really focused on how you apply that technology. An AWS or a Microsoft, we have a lot of lawyers, and we will do just fine in those circumstances, but the SMEs will not. And we really, I think, need to help governments think about how to enable those SMEs to really adopt AI. The second is at that bilateral level. If you look back to 1991, the Acid Rain Treaty, you had a great conservative government in Canada, you had a strong government in the US, and they came together, and one of the big focuses on the Acid Rain Treaty actually was about a common approach to science and measurement. You see a theme coming out today about this common approach to science and measurement and where we can actually have these very targeted bilateral interventions with each other to deepen our understanding of the issue at hand, and by the way, make measurable progress on emissions in our ozone layer over the last, feels like a really long time now, 30-something years. And then finally, this question about the global governance level, what's happening at the G7 with the Hiroshima AI process and the code of conduct that started in the Japanese presidency. We've now had the Italian presidency of the G7 this year that's been advancing this concept of an OECD reporting framework to align on common transparency measures about companies who are adhering to that code of conduct. I think when we talk about the questions of trust and certainty, and how do we engender trust and certainty, it is about how we can translate those things from a European market, from a Japanese market, from a US market to a Canadian market, and say, we are playing from the same rule book. We are all agreeing to this set of requirements, and that frankly helps to engender public trust when we can say just as easily as we cross borders with our great passports, if you have a Canadian passport, it's really nice, that we are doing the same thing with our AI regulation.
Okay, thank you. And I want to stay on the binational level just for a second before we jump to multinational. Mark, you have a foot in both countries, Canada and the U.S. Can you take off from where Kate is saying and delve a little bit deeper? What does Canada-U.S. cooperation on AI actually look like?
Or what could it look like?
What could it look like, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I think one, standards alignment is probably low-hanging fruit, ultimately, for collaboration on artificial intelligence and kind of implementation of regulation. For those of you who are less familiar, we're the last panel. I promise not to talk too much about standards. It's not the super sexy topic, but it's how you get like the actual meat into like understanding what it is you're supposed to comply against, right? So it's great to say you shall be transparent, with your whatever, like subcomponent of your artificial intelligence solution, but what does that transparency actually mean? Like, what are you supposed to actually put forward? Gets defined in standards. In most circumstances, those are international standards that are adhered to by kind of all major countries. There's a degree of divergence at the moment between some of the standards that are being developed in ISO, the International Standards Organization, some of those that are being defined by NIST and US-based bodies, and then the process that's happening in the EU to kind of define standards to underpin the EU AI Act. There is going to be, I think, ultimately decisions to be made as to, which standards we choose to adopt. And I think greater cooperation between the U.S. and Canada, and frankly, ensuring that those standards are based off of a technical understanding and a strong engineering understanding of how artificial intelligence works, is one part of making sure that those standards actually function in practice. Because of the need to get standards developed extremely quickly to inform the EU AI Act, we have a degree of concern as to how informed those standards will be during that time frame. So I think that's probably a space that is ripe for a high degree of collaboration. And then more broadly speaking, I think that we've seen the concept of kind of digital solidarity mentioned in the U.S. I think there is a opportunity to flesh that out with your closest ally right to the north, and to try to figure out which subcomponents of solidarity for AI make sense, especially with Canada. We know that energy supply, for instance, is a concern with regards to ensuring that we have the right energy supply for data centers to power AI applications. There's already strong grid integration between Canada and the U.S. Much of the energy in New York is provided by Hydro-Quebec, for instance. Critical minerals alignment between the Safety Institute to be announced in Canada and the U.S. There's a lot of subcomponents that we could play with that I think would make sense to explore in a bilateral manner as part of a potential kind of AI pact to start to inform and have a blueprint for what potentially AI solidarity with like-minded countries, what that should look like, the form it should take.
Great, thank you, Mark. Kelly, as Mark said, we like to think that Canada is certainly the United States' closest partner, but I think we're all aware that it's not the only partner. Can you walk us through if there are other bilateral efforts happening to align standards or AI regulation between the United States and other countries that aren't Canada, or is there perhaps a blueprint that we can follow that the United States is laying out with other allies?
Well, I think just real quick to say, I love what Mark just laid out on the role that the U.S.-Canada relationship can play here, because I think, to the earlier point, if it looks like we have no governing ethos to how we're acting on AI, then we have a messaging problem that we need to work on, and Canada is the place where we can work on that. If we can figure out the way to convey to Canada, this is what we believe, what the EU believes is very clear. Here's what we believe should be done. Here's what that means for governance. How do we make this happen? Then that's how we start crystallizing this message so that we can get it out. We have a lot of things that we're doing overseas. We have not been as good at this as China has been. China has approached it as an infrastructure problem first. So with Belt and Road, they built all the infrastructure that now people are using to implement this technology. And they're using that to have a very strong message of the United States is an obstacle to you. The United States does not want you to have strong compute, strong talent. The United States wants to hold you back. And so it's very important that we show up on the international stage and empower other countries and also work with them as collaborators and not in a paternalistic aid and development mindset. We have the advantage of, it's an advantage and a disadvantage, that all of the major labs, for the most part, are located in the United States. And so there's a little bit of a foreign aggressor note to that. We are the ones who did this to you. You're welcome. But that also gives us a lot of ability to be generous and to be reaching out to people. And so at the UN General Assembly meetings this year, you saw the State Department brought heads of all the major labs and compute companies, including Amazon Web Services and Microsoft, to talk about the new global partnership on inclusivity for AI. And so making the statement that not only do we have very strong democratic values that for us is the way we talk about technology, but also that we are going to bring with us the corporations that depend on the United States or that are a part of the United States fabric to either join with them to make those commitments or to strong arm them into making commitments to be better for the entire world. And so I think we don't have, and this is something that I should be able to answer in more detail, I am not aware of any really robust bilateral things going on. We're always very close with the EU. We have several things going on with the TTP talks, not as much as there should be. But we clearly have taken in this year, I would say, the stance that this is the time for the United States to try to serve as a leader for a lot of these conversations and to serve as the vanguard for democratic values in AI. There's a war going on for hearts and minds over how will you use this. And we see countries like India, who we generally think of as a friend. India agrees with us about things. India wants to use AI the way China uses AI. They have a security problem. They have a large population that seems very attractive to them. So how can we reach out to these people and paint a picture of what does it look like to use AI with American values?
Yeah, Mark, please.
I was going to really quick little additional comment on this. I mean, I think there is a historical precedent for something like what we were talking about for AI in the Canada-US example, and I think that's the Auto Pact, right? Like the Auto Pact was a bilateral agreement between Canada and the US, but it also included side agreements between Canada and the major car manufacturers to increase production in Canada, to have like a certain degree of assurances that were brought to the Canadian government in exchange for, you know, one, regulatory alignment between Canada and the U.S., Canada adopting a U.S.-based transportation standards, and a whole slew of other commitments. So I think, you know, we can look at that as a historical example and think of, in modern day, you know, if you look at the four big auto manufacturers of the 60s and you look at, you know, CSPs and companies now, what does that look like for artificial intelligence? What can we pull from that? And then that shouldn't just be, for lack of a better expression, lectures. You know, it should be like concrete, actual terms that we can put on the table. And again, if you can't do it with Canada, it's going to be very hard to do with any other country. So might as well start with a simple agreement. Simple is still quite complex, but the simplest one that you can, and then move on from there.
Yeah, and sorry, I
No,
apologize.
please.
But just to pick up on that, I do actually think you're seeing a little bit of U.S. action towards these more kind of bilateral MOUs. You saw one announced 2 weeks ago. Time has run together with the UAE. As part of the UAE state visit, but they take a very different tone and tenor when you're having these conversations with a country like the UAE. That's a way more national security and safety focused conversation. It's really about it's more about a risk governance conversation than it is about an adoption and an opportunity and an integration conversation that I think we've all been kind of proselytizing here.
I want to pick up on that point, because if we think about the Auto Pact as a precursor to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, a precursor to NAFTA, and a precursor to USMCA, obviously digital trade is not necessarily the same as AI standards and regulation alignment, but could we see a North American approach either through USMCA or through some other mechanism towards aligning our standards, not just with Canada and the US, but also Mexico, or is that a step too far? Why or why not? Anyone can feel free to take that one.
I personally, this is not an Amazon position, but I think you're better to start as small as you can and to build from there. It will already be, despite me saying it was simple, quite complex to get such a deal across the finish line. I think the additional complexities that will come by adding Mexico at the start, and especially if you put it as part of UMCA, then the trade-offs that come as part of an agreement will include, dairy and other factors that have really nothing to do with AI. Personally, I'd like to see it happen by just having the right people in the room concentrated specifically on artificial intelligence with as few jurisdictions as possible. And once again, you have that template, then maybe from there you can move on to include other countries, though that will kind of bring in kind of WTO issues as well. Like you got to make sure that you proof it.
Yeah, I think there's certainly USMCA, complicated subject in my household because it's exactly the same age as my son, having been on the negotiating side for Canada on that one. And I think one of the complicating factors that you have with USMCA right now, it's a renewal conversation that's in front of us. It's not a reopening of the whole thing. And that is actually, frankly, one of the challenges about these big free trade agreements is that they can be very out of date by the time they are reopened. And I think one of the things that you've heard throughout the course of the day is just how fast the space is changing, how much we're learning as we go, particularly as it relates to testing and evaluations and measurement, and that the sort of the natural home for it isn't necessarily something that takes years and years and years to reopen. However, is there an importance to digital trade principles being part of that conversation that then would apply to AI? Absolutely.
I'm just going to tack on one more thing. I think it was Elham and Mark this morning who said, we're talking about even once you define something, the way that things are expressed. Like if you define risk, you define high
Impact.
then the way that a risky thing expresses itself in healthcare is very different than the expression of it in housing, and they require different approaches. Now you add on another cultural layer on top of that. So you have Canada has a different taste for risk. Canada has a different housing system. Canada has a different, and then if we want to tack on our southern neighbors, well, now we've really made this complex. And so I think almost like our ability to find a way with Canada, who we are linguistically, culturally, and economically very similar to, how do we navigate the things where our economies diverge and where the needs of our legislative processes diverge? And then once we figure that out, how did we do it this time? Then we go to somebody who's more different than us and we say, okay, we're going to do this again, but now we know what we're doing, kind of. And we have a better chance of being able to build a regime where we're all pointed in the same direction, but we have enough flexibility that we can do what our individual countries need to do.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And just one last question on the international level before we go to our audience questions. So get your questions ready if you have them. Canada's hosting the G7 next year, and given how forward-leaning Ottawa has been on artificial intelligence, the strength of our ecosystem, I don't think it's out of the question that AI is going to be somewhere on the agenda. So if you were advising people who are going to the G7, advising leaders, what do you think a tangible, impactful piece of policy to come out of the G7 would be? While also thinking realistically. We don't, as Mark would say, we don't have a magic wand that we can just wave and get the ideal policy. Being realistic, what should we expect coming out of that?
Okay. I think a focus on AI adoption because of the productivity question that we talked about before. I think we have a broad handle, thanks to the Hiroshima process and then the OECD questionnaire that accompanies it that's been in development on what the kind of horizontal AI safety commitments are. So I don't think it's about adding net new safety commitments as much as continuing to operationalize those, probably getting the first questionnaires or responses to those questionnaires handed in by those who have voluntarily committed to those next year. And so considering that, I think a focus on adoption, what it means for productivity, and trying to get a handle of what best practices for AI diffusion and AI adoption are from a policy perspective. And then a degree of commitment towards those, including improvement of public services through AI. I think that's likely to be a subject matter definitely of interest to the Canadian government, and that would make sense as part of G7 conversations. We've already had in the communique from last week or a couple weeks ago from the last meeting at the Digital Ministers meeting, reference to this as a subject matter. So that would make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of plus one that, I guess, I do think there's been a lot of references to the printing press today. And what's interesting when you look at the history of the printing press, a sentence I never thought I'd say, is that despite it being invented in Germany, it was really Netherlands that propelled its adoption because it just decided that it was going to. And there was this sort of very small country, but very intense focus on how they did that. And all of a sudden you saw the printing press diffuse rapidly across the Netherlands. And I think that is the kind of example where, frankly, it's a little bit counter to the Canadian narrative around AI right now, where we say, oh, we're the home of AI because we have Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, and we should be very proud of those things. We should be very proud of the foundational science that the country has put into it. However, we have not fulfilled that other side of the equation, and frankly, it's a conversation we hear all the time in Europe as well, where European companies are also saying to us, well, how do we kind of get in on this conversation a little bit more too, and how can we make sure that this is part of the G7 agenda? So I think that's definitely the adoption and diffusion piece is a core element of it. And what I would say, again, a kind of unique role for a Canadian presidency is these stereotypes exist for a reason. Canada is an excellent broker at the G7 table, and they're very good at sort of institutionalizing and getting consensus around those institutions. And so how they can take some of those safety issues that Marc-Etienne was raising and really establish proper governance structures to make them more resilient would be an interesting kind of sub level to a Canadian G7 agenda.
I don't know if they will talk about it, but I would be interested in the G7 tackling this question of access to compute. Mark Shan talked about it this morning. Canada has a great interest in building up their sovereign compute levels. We have a bunch and we want more. Everybody wants more. We already have this very problematic and difficult conversation going on with our allies about our export controls on chips and the way that we are trying to put the squeeze on people, and it changes different economic calculus for these companies. Now we're adding on top of that, so we're trying to keep certain people from having them, and we're also now competing with one another for all of these very powerful chips, which have a very limited quantity at any given time. How are we, as the G7, supposed to work together if we are simultaneously punching one another under the table trying to get access to chips? If I get them at your expense, then I'm going to do that, even if we're friends. That's a really big question, I think, and I'm not sure that they are going to take it up, but I think it is very important, especially as everyone individually is targeting that as a national priority for spending.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Audience questions? Yes, sir, right there. We'll bring a microphone to you so the online audience can hear as well.
Thank you. Great panel. I appreciate the comments. I have a question for Kate and Mark of Microsoft at AWS, and I apologize if you've already discussed this. I was here late. So my question is about knowledge sharing or enablement of policymakers, meaning, of course, you're talking about adoption, but how much is the private sector, meaning AWS and Microsoft, actually doing that? And it's really tricky because you don't want to see us influencing policy, but clearly there's a lot of education that you need to do in that sector, right? And the second question I have is about data privacy and protection, right? And this is a concern without AI, but with AI, I think it's even more so, right? So I want to see if there's anything that proactively both AWS and Microsoft are doing to mitigate those types of concerns. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think on the question of sort of education of policy makers, as well as even frankly just general public, I do think that there is a base level of understanding that kind of needs to, not to borrow a phrase, but needs to diffuse through government services. I mean, I think both Mark Etienne and I would say it's amazing how we end up talking to the exact same set of stakeholders in every country that we operate, and it's like the same 5 people. And we need it to be more like the same 100 people in each of these markets. And so how can we expand that base? Certainly there's a lot of skilling initiatives that we do through Microsoft and through LinkedIn. But I also think that there is also what Mark Sean was talking about this morning, actually, about sort of governments thinking a little bit more centrally about how they think about AI in government and how do they actually train their own people, and with the support of companies, but it can't just be us, and it shouldn't just be us, I think.
It's a good question. We have a slew of programs like Machine Learning University and other like free online courses that we refer the general public, but also policymakers to be able to educate themselves as much as possible on these issues. We obviously participate, and Kate can attest to this, to hundreds, if not thousands, of roundtables and various forms of meetings that governments organize around AI, and do our best to try to educate policymakers in those settings and participate in committee hearings and the like that are set up. I think that overall, I've been in this space since about 2017 in government AI space, and people are generally slightly more knowledgeable than they were in 2017, which is good. But circling back to what we were talking about at the start, and I'll take a last pot shot as like one central silver bullet piece of legislation, the ability to understand every single form of AI and every single application of AI and every single sector of AI. If you say, oh, it's AI, these are the 3 people who are responsible for the AI in our government. Let them handle it. It's just an impossible task. None of us could do this on this table. It's our job to be deeply knowledgeable about AI policy. I think when you have a central team that is numbers in the hundreds, the UK has this, that is responsible for being kind of a cross-cutting support mechanism really for other departments to be able to educate themselves about how AI applies to the use cases with which they are deeply familiar, then it's about them understanding the implications of AI to what they already know as opposed to AI experts broadly trying to understand every single possible use case, which is just the knowledge gap is just too high. I mean, we don't want to speak for Kate and Kelly, but like when you ask me about this specific subfactor of AI in financial services and then medical devices, and then I can't know all these things. And I don't think anybody can. So there's also just an instrumental approach of how governments set themselves up to be knowledgeable on these issues that is pretty key.
We'll go back to audience questions in just a second, but Mark, a follow-up to what you were saying. I remember when I first came to the Wilson Center, 5G was all the rage, as techies love to say, the sexy issue. I don't know why that's the go-to term whenever you're talking to tech people. I think I've heard it more times on stage here than I've heard it any other time in any other event at the Wilson Center. But jumping off that, Mark, there was a lot of hype around 5G when I first came on. Now all the hype is around AI. For a while it was around semiconductors. Is there a risk of, as the hype dies down for AI, that we continue to lose resources, especially in government where resources are finite, dedicated to looking at use cases or implementation or adoption? And if so, how do we, A, mitigate that, or B, just learn to adapt and live with it?
It's a great question.
No, thank you.
You're doing a great job. Look, like, I think it's a real risk. I think we like the broad, community, we have been hyper-focused on kind of frontier AI and frontier AI risks and even kind of existential risk type questions. And part of the solution, if we want to have more permanent attention and focus on AI, is to kind of take a step back and look at the broad types of AI applications that exist, the traditional forms of AI, and the way in which we were talking about productivity gains and so on. AI is already out there. When you tell people, I don't trust artificial intelligence, if you hear that from a member of the public or an elected official, it's like, did you use, Google Maps to get somewhere? Did you, do you like the Netflix recommendation for the next movie you're going to watch? You are already interacting with a ton of artificial intelligence solutions, right? So try to bring back the focus to this is in back-end supply chain, management, what's the word I'm looking for? Predictive maintenance tooling, like trying to broaden the understanding of the variegated forms in which AI exists and tying that to, the core mission of the various departments who are going to be responsible for ensuring that, Canada or another country is still at the cutting edge. You could replace AI with electricity or the internet in a sentence and say I'm not going to worry about electricity in agriculture. I was like, well, come on, man. You're going to have to worry about electricity in agriculture. It's not a choice, We need to get a shift from I'm not the frontier risk person to everybody has AI as part of their core mandate.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that we think about it is AI, and my boss certainly says this all the time, AI is a GPT, but it's not Chat GPT. It's a general purpose technology. It's an economic term. It is not a specific technology in the way that 5G or even frankly semiconductors are. This is something that underpins so many different applications in society. And so how governments start to pivot their thinking to thinking about it as something as fundamental as electricity is I think the big shift that we're in the middle of the conversation of, and one of the biggest challenges is that that policymakers are rightly responding to public pressure to go fast on these things because that is their job. If I was still in government, that is what I would absolutely be telling policymakers to do. At the same time, we are learning. We have to be deliberate about how we're learning, and we have to be thoughtful. And we can't move at the same pace that electricity was diffused with the electric circus that traveled around the country showing, hey, look how great it will be if you can run this light in your kitchen. We don't have that luxury, and so we both have to move fast and move slow at the same time.
I would agree with what both of them said, and also want to say that I think actually I would find it very welcome if some of the froth died down because right now people that you used to be able to have a very cogent conversation with about algorithmic bias, now when you talk about algorithms, they're like, what is that? Like, oh, is that AI? Well, how are you using chatbots in farming? Like, we're not using chatbots in farming. There are other forms of AI, and you used to know that. And we are having to, the generative AI has obliterated the conversation completely and made it very difficult to talk to people in some ways. And there's also a lot of there's a lot of AI experts in this town who 2 years ago were blockchain experts, and 3 years before that they were 5G experts, and in 2 years from now they'll be quantum experts. And when those guys exit the field, it will be back to like, okay, let's have a real conversation. What are the actual uses of AI? What are the actual problems of AI? How can we stop making everything an app and stop making everything a chatbot? And what do we actually do with this? And kind of what Kate was talking about with the electric circus, people will start. There are some people who are now thinking, oh, well, the hype's over, which means it's not real. No. The hype is over, which means we're done playing. Now we're using, we're working, we're integrating, and people are learning to do that. And once you integrate AI into your practice of whatever you're doing, you start having a very different conversation than when you were only using it to make Snoop Dogg write Shakespeare. I think it's going to be a really welcome thing. I think the people who think the froth dying down means that this is so over just really have not been paying attention to what is actually happening with this tech.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks for the tip on quantum. We'll see everyone in 2 years for the Canada-US Symposium on quantum. But before that, any other questions from the audience? In the back right there, and then sir, we'll go to you, and then ma'am to you.
Thank you guys so much for this panel. It's been very informative. My question falls with youth and AI. I think we all know like kids are very prone to harms of social media, and now with social media integrating AI, it's getting slightly worse. There was a school district in America that had some of their young girls kind of have deep fakes created and spread around about them. And then recently we saw a death of a 15-year-old boy, I think it was, at the hands of an AI app. So we're seeing these AI apps kind of really target children who are going to be more vulnerable. So I guess in the regulation with protecting children against AI, do you think that's going to fall at the government and at the policymaker level, or do you think it falls on the app makers who are making and promoting these apps to children to kind of have a more responsibility to step in and stop the harm? Thank you.
And just because of time, I think we're going to take all three questions at the same time and then address them. So you, sir, in the green-gray coat.
Thanks. I just wanted to maybe ask you about the elephant in the room, which is how does prospects for bilateral or multilateral AI cooperation change depending on the outcome in November elections?
Thank you. And lastly, ma'am.
Thank you. Mine's kind of similar, but I guess I was wondering, how do you drive forward a shared agenda in this world when the audience is more skeptical I would say every day? There's a more polarizing view of AI across whether it's the private sector, whether it's government. So how do you kind of move forward the agenda and the needle when there's so many different opinions across the board?
Thank you all. Who'd like to go first?
If I can jump on the first question about kids and AI, I think this is where the froth has really killed us, because we created this technology that people can talk to and befriend, and we were like, wonderful, loneliness is solved. It's amazing. And nobody ever really thought about just how lonely someone who is isolated with only a digital companion really is, and what that does to your long-term ability to make friends. If you've never had a friend who disagreed with you, then do you really know how to be human? And so I think the fault is kind of on all sides right now, because we just pushed these things out and we were like, it's going to be great. It's going to be great. People just need someone to talk to. It's going to be great. We didn't really think about the fact that like the thing is going to say things back. And also you are going to want it to be a specific thing. You are going to twist it. And particularly if you are a very lonely 15-year-old boy, you are going to use these tools in a way, and this is kind of, Elham was talking about, some of the harms and risks are not things we can test for at the company in the labs, because these harms and risks don't emerge until you have a lonely 15-year-old boy using a thing. So the people who built it never really saw this coming. It was not intentionally harmful, but it's very harmful. And now that we're getting out of the froth, we're realizing like, oh my gosh, like these, therapist bots are very dangerous. Nutritionist bots actually usually recommend anorexia. Children's companions are very isolating, and they also can lead you down these really weird, radical paths. All of these things are dangerous. I think I would say this would be one of those narrow cases that Congress actually is quite suited to make legislation about, once we figure out like how do you define appropriate use, appropriate audiences. And I think that we'll do that in conjunction with the private sector. I think the private sector will help us figure out. They're not interested in killing kids. we need to figure this out together. How can we define these audiences, define the uses of these things, and then find a way to build the framework that lets parents trust technology with their kids?
That was a great answer.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Look, we don't want to beat a dead horse here, but like, we're done a disservice when we try to regulate or talk about AI broadly speaking, and we are far more able to tackle the types of issues that you've talked about in the questions when we talk about very specific use cases of artificial intelligence, both with regards to developing, the types of either regulatory adaptation or net new laws to address those specific use cases, and with regards to building trust and developing adoption in the right types of circumstances. So a very concrete example that was debated in the House of Commons, non-consensual deep fake pornographic images. The response initially from the Canadian government is like, we'll try to encompass that within C27 and IDA as another high-risk AI use case. Then this is just yet another thing you're trying to solve with like the big mega silver cannon, not silver bullet, like just enormous bill you're trying to do when, we had on the books the ability with, I think it was 3 words in a change of the criminal code to make sure that it was explicitly illegal to share non-consensual deepfake pornographic images. You had full private sector buy-in and public buy-in for something like that. It was an obvious thing that you could address. And I think going towards trust building, Kate talked about the need for speed. I think that's the kind of thing you can do when you talk about individual use cases. And then by breaking down those concepts, you can also talk about things that are very obviously just make our lives better and have like zero controversy about them. Like I talked about predictive maintenance tools for various forms of public infrastructure, say, like that's useful for us. So we need to just talk, I think, more precisely about those types of questions. And then to the question about how the U.S. election will affect the potential for a bilateral deal, I think it's a deal that just makes sense on both sides of the border, no matter who's in power on both sides of the border, because there's also an election in Canada very likely in the next 12 months. And I think the subcomponents of what can be part of that deal may vary slightly depending on who's in power on both sides, but it's still something that I think makes sense, notwithstanding who the 4 potential deal makers are.
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on the elections piece, I think that's exactly right. I think whichever combination of those 4 players you get in 2025, they're all very interested in a growth agenda. And so I think, where we can find commonality around that is a great opportunity. I think there also is a recognition across the board, again, with all 4 players, that the Canada-U.S. relationship is critically important to both countries, that our integration is just frankly too deep to ignore. And they actually, all 4 of them, have shown the ability to do deals together. And we've seen that in the past. And so I think that's something that we will likely see in 2025. Just on the question about the sort of shared, how do you advance a shared agenda and the polarization of the conversation, I think one of the biggest things that's missing today, and maybe it's not totally true in this room, but really not a lot of people have their hands on the tools in a way that's integrated into their day-to-day lives. And I think, sometimes when we talk about use cases, and I'm totally guilty of this, we're all guilty of this, we're talking about it on such a broad scale that it seems almost fantastical. Like, oh my gosh, you could cure skin cancer. And that is absolutely something that can be achieved over time, and it's a goal that we all should have. It is also true that at the end of the day, when I get home tonight, I'm going to use a co-pilot to help me figure out what I'm going to pack in my kids' lunches tomorrow, and help me manage the schedule for the rest of the week with my husband, and figure out just like how to make my life a little tiny bit easier, or frankly, use a co-pilot on my teams, not to like plug for our product, to manage my global team. And that all gets together on a call, and I go, oh my gosh, what did everybody say? I'm one person. How am I supposed to remember all of these things that are happening in Indonesia and the EU and Japan and Canada? But I can get a summarization of that, and it can help me track that. Little things, and they seem meaningless, but little things that make my life a little bit easier help me trust the technology more and help me want to adopt the technology more, because life is hard enough. And we're all busy enough. And so I think the more that we see that, and the more that we can kind of advance that conversation and see the use of the tools more, we get to build that shared agenda.
Thanks, Kate. I want to give our panelists just one last opportunity to give closing remarks. Maybe we'll go in reverse order from what we started. So just leave the audience with one big idea takeaway. Kate, can we start with you? What would you want, closing out the symposium, not just the panel, what do you want people to come away with? No pressure?
No pressure. I think that one of my biggest takeaways from today, but also just generally in our work, is that we have this unique moment in time with AI where we are a little bit working with a blank piece of paper. There aren't necessarily really stringent playbooks that we can be pulling from and saying like, this is the way that we're going to do this, and this is great. And so I think one of the things that's so interesting about my job, and Mark Etienne's job as well, and Kelly's job, is that we get to draw from all of these great global minds and say like, well, what is the best way to do this? How would you think about that? We get to be thought partners together in a brand new exercise. And so, where Canada and the US are so deeply aligned and so deeply integrated, I think we can draw from each other even more. And so I think today was a great example of that, and convenings like this are a great example of that.
Thanks, Kate. Mark?
Well, I'll be stereotypically Canadian. My son plays competitive hockey. And as part of his hockey training, which is all-encompassing and takes most of my time after my job, he had to read this book on the right mental mindset for being an athlete. And the thesis was essentially break down all these challenges into subcomponents, deal with them one at a time, and then you achieve success in the long run. You didn't get a great shot immediately, you broke it down into the subcomponents you needed to have. I think we're kind of guilty of that in AI, both on the adoption front and on the regulation front, of trying to put it on all of us to figure it all out now in one fell swoop. Both with regards to either if you're in the business world or in the government world, how we're going to adopt all these AI solutions immediately, including next-gen AI, generative AI solutions. And on the regulatory front, get the one big bill that's going to kind of fix all of these issues. And that's not how it works, practically speaking. We didn't regulate the internet, we didn't regulate electricity, all these general purpose technologies with 7 people that figured it all out for the internet in 1999 with the one bill, right? It's like a series of ongoing small pieces of regulation and of legislation. And on the adoption front, the same thing. Not thinking through, we're going to do the big AI and be done with it, but thinking through what are small subcomponents that can make me as a person, as a business, as a government more productive? What existing solutions exist that we can leverage right now that in the grand scheme of things accumulate to large productivity gains? So I think the concluding remark is just, we don't have to figure it all out. We just have to break down subcomponents and start to deal with them one after the other.
Thank you, Mark. Kelly?
It's hard to follow that one up because I feel like we should just stop there. But I want to echo something that Maura said on the previous panel. This technology is a uniquely human technology, and I think it requires a much wider range of disciplines to help us figure out how to use it, how to govern it, how to manage it. It's time to bring the sociologists and the philosophers and the political scientists back in the room for the tech stuff. And I think this is especially notable, to your point about children being affected. This technology has unique human reverberations because it feels human. It feels real. And the algorithms that came before generative AI, much far before, it kind of had that same feel of someone leading you by the hand to the things that you couldn't find in this massive pile of stuff on Netflix or on YouTube or in a map, and someone just helping you. Here's what you need. You didn't know you liked this, but you do. Here it is. Grappling with that human dynamic requires more than just technologists and engineers in the room. And policymakers are going to need to consult a wider range of people. And so I think that's something that we try to do a lot in our work. And I think that's something that a lot of us feel, it's time to widen the table.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kelly Wicker, Kate Purchase, Marc-Étienne Ouimet. Please give them a big round of applause. I'm going to call Christopher Sands up to the podium to close out, but just one last announcement. It is Mara Grossman's birthday today, and we're not going to sing her happy birthday. We won't embarrass her like that, but if you see her on the way out, please wish her a happy birthday. Chris, over to you.
Sure, it's my pleasure just to bring us all to a close. I want to remind you of a couple of things. One, this would not have been possible without Kelly and this Science, Technology, Innovation Program. We know a lot about Canada, but she knows a lot about technology, and she says, widen the conversation, bring it together. This has been great. Thank you for the partnership. It also would not have been possible without the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. Steve's here. We've got some people here who are part of it. The other Steve. Really, the Canada-U.S. Law Institute is, in some ways, a reflection of something we talked about all day, which is that the value of U.S. Canadians as culturally similar, mutually respectful partners being able to have a conversation about things that really matter. And they've been doing that for quite a long time. We're really glad to be partners in bringing that conversation here. Remember that they're having a conference in April, 10 and 11, yeah, I almost remember that. I'm only on the board. 10 and 11, in April, they're having a conference focused on USMCA negotiations, which, and the review that's coming up, so a very hot topic. Do corner one of these folks or me later, and I'll make sure you're on the mailing list for that big conference. And last but not least, I just wanted to add one thing which kind of comes to, for me as a Canadianist, is the most important takeaway from this, which is, I think there's a huge demonstration effect for U.S. leadership around the world when we do things with Canadians. Do we have the ability to force our hand? We're bigger, we're stronger, we're louder. Could we force Canada to adopt our standards? Could we work on this just through might? Yes, but we don't. And I think the lesson for so many other countries around the world is the U.S. is willing to be, can be, at its best, an evidence-based partner in coming up with the rules of the road. And that's what makes the rules-based order that is U.S.-led, or has been U.S.-led, so attractive to so many people. So it starts with a conversation with the Canadians, who we could bully, we sometimes do, but we mostly don't. And for that, I think there's some hope for all of us, technology and beyond. Thank you very much. Have a great night.